Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. The weather was typical Missouri fall, overcast, kind of muggy, around 65 degrees. We'd set up camp earlier that morning, nothing fancy, just 2 tents and a basic site. My daughter Emma, 6, and son Josh, 9, were excited because it was their first time camping since before the divorce. I remember checking my phone. It was about 2:30 p.m. when we realized we needed more firewood for the evening. The 4 of us headed down this narrow trail about a quarter mile from our campsite. The trees were thick there, lots of cedars mixed with oak and hickory. The leaves were just starting to turn, creating this weird, muted light under the cloud cover. Everything seemed normal. We could hear birds, squirrels, the usual forest sounds. Emma was walking slightly ahead of us, doing that thing little kids do where they have to step on every interesting-looking stick. She suddenly stopped dead in her tracks. I'll never forget the way her little body just froze. She didn't scream or cry. She just pointed up with a shaking hand. That's when it happened. About 40 feet ahead of us, this thing just dropped from one of the bigger cedars. The sound it made hitting the ground, God, I can still hear it. It was this deep, hollow thud that you could feel in your chest, like someone dropping a massive log, but softer somehow. I know exactly how tall it was because Tom is 6'2", and this thing was easily 3 feet taller than him. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Its arms were too long, hanging down past its knees, but it wasn't bulky like you see in those Patterson film stills. This thing was lean, almost lanky, but you could tell it was powerful. The hair is what I remember most vividly. It wasn't like bear fur or anything I've ever seen on a known animal. It was this dark brown-black color, but it moved weird, kind of wavy or shaggy, especially around its shoulders. Not matted like you'd expect from a wild animal, but not smooth either. The way it moved, that's what really messes with me when I think about it. You'd expect something that big to be clumsy, right? But it wasn't. When it landed, it did this fluid motion to stand upright that reminded me of those parkour videos, but smoother, more natural. It was this incredible combination of power and grace that just shouldn't be possible for something that size. Josh started crying right then, which I think is what made it look at us. Its head turned so fast, but I couldn't make out its face clearly through the hair. It was just this quick movement, and then it was gone, weaving between the trees like it knew exactly where each one was without looking. The whole thing couldn't have lasted more than 10 seconds. But time got weird, you know? Like when you're in a car accident, and everything slows down but speeds up at the same time. I grabbed Emma and pulled her back toward me. She was shaking but still hadn't made a sound. Tom had his hands on Josh's shoulders, and we all just stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two. The woods had gone completely silent. That's when I noticed it. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. There was this smell too, which I didn't notice during the encounter, but hit me afterward. Not overpowering, but distinct, like wet leaves and something musty. Not quite rotting, but organic. It's hard to describe. We didn't run. I think we were too shocked to run. We just turned around and walked back to camp as quickly as we could while trying to stay quiet. I kept looking over my shoulder, but we never saw it again. The kids were unusually quiet the whole way back. When we got to the campsite, we had this surreal moment where nobody knew what to say. How do you process something like that? Tom suggested we pack up and leave, but somehow that felt more frightening than staying, like the movement might attract attention. So we stayed, built up a huge fire way earlier than we needed to, and sat close together until dark. The strange thing is, I never felt like it wanted to hurt us. It seemed more surprised to see us than we were to see it. The way it moved through those trees, it knew that forest better than any human could. That's what strikes me now. It moved like it was at home, and we were the intruders. We didn't sleep much that night. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves had us on edge. The kids stayed in my tent, and neither complained about sharing the small space. By morning, the forest sounds had returned to normal, but we packed up quickly and left. Later, Tom and I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone in a suit. but the movement was too fluid, too natural. A bear? Not with those proportions and that way of moving. We looked up local reports and found a few similar sightings in the area from the 90s, but nothing recent. Emma didn't talk about it for weeks. Then one day, while drawing, she made this picture of what she called the tree person. The proportions in her drawing were exactly what we saw, those long arms, the lean build. She's 10 now, and sometimes she still asks me if I remember that day with the tree person. How could I forget? I've never gone camping in that area again. Tom took the kids once last summer, but they stayed in a different spot. I think about reporting it officially sometimes, but who would believe it? 4 people saw it clear as day, in broad daylight, and I still question myself sometimes. But then I remember that hollow thud when it landed, the impossible grace of its movement, and that complete silence that fell over the forest, and I know what I saw. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, I wouldn't believe it if someone told it to me. But it happened. Sometimes when it's quiet and I'm alone, I still think about how many other things might be out there in our forests, things that are better at hiding than we are at finding them. The weirdest part, the kids want to go camping again this fall. They're not traumatized like you'd expect. Maybe they're braver than me, or maybe when you're young, it's easier to accept that the world is more mysterious than we think. But if we do go, you can bet we'll be staying far away from those cedar trees in Potosi. Story 2. I never thought I'd share this, but what happened to me in Bismarck, Missouri last year still keeps me up at night. I need to get this off my chest, even though I know some people might think I'm crazy. This happened in June 2020, during a camping trip with my ex-husband Mike and our Siberian husky Zeus. Zeus was always this massive, confident dog, 120 pounds of pure muscle and attitude. He'd chase bears out of our yard back home without hesitation. Nothing ever scared him. Well, almost nothing, until that night. We'd set up camp in Mark Twain National Forest, about 15 miles outside Bismarck. It was a spot Mike and I had been to several times before, pretty secluded, but not too far from the logging roads. The weather was perfect that weekend. Clear skies, mild temperature, just a slight breeze. We'd spent the day hiking and fishing at the nearby creek. Around 2 a.m., we were lying in our tent, watching some stupid movie on Mike's phone to help us fall asleep. Zeus was curled up between us, something he never did. He usually preferred to sleep at our feet. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it had gotten. Usually you'd hear crickets, owls, all sorts of nature sounds, but suddenly there was nothing. Just dead silence. That's when Zeus started acting weird. He pressed himself against me so hard it almost hurt, trembling like I'd never seen before. His ears were pinned back, and he was making this low, whining sound in his throat. Mike noticed it too, and turned off the phone. Then we heard it. I don't even know how to describe that sound. It started like a low moan, but then it built into this ungodly scream that sounded like a cross between an air raid siren and something dying. The sound kept getting louder and deeper, and I could literally feel it vibrating inside my chest. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. Not a bear, not a mountain lion, nothing natural. The scream lasted maybe 30, 45 seconds, but it felt like forever. Zeus completely lost it. He urinated all over himself and tried to burrow underneath me, still trembling violently. This was our fearless dog who'd faced down bears, now reduced to a terrified mess. Mike grabbed his flashlight and the hunting knife he always carried, but we were too scared to leave the tent. We could hear heavy footsteps circling our campsite, breaking branches that sounded too thick to be broken easily. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like whatever it was wanted us to know it was there. This went on for about an hour. Just these slow, heavy steps circling us, occasional wood breaks, and this heavy breathing that sounded almost human, but wrong. Too deep, too powerful. Finally, Mike remembered he had some Bigfoot recordings saved on his phone from a YouTube video he'd been watching earlier that week. He'd been joking about Bigfoot during our hike. He turned up the volume on his phone and played one of the calls through the car speakers. Our car was parked about 30 feet from our tent. That's when all hell broke loose. Whatever was out there immediately responded with another one of those horrible screams, but this time it was angry. Then the rocks started hitting our car, not pebbles, actual rocks, hitting hard enough to dent the hood and crack our windshield. Large branches came next, crashing against the roof and sides of our car. The whole thing probably lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like hours. The attack stopped as suddenly as it started. We sat there in absolute silence for what felt like forever, too terrified to move. Zeus had practically crawled inside my sleeping bag with me, still shaking. When dawn finally came, we packed up our camp in record time. The area around our car was littered with rocks and branches. These weren't small sticks either. Some of the branches were as thick as my arm and looked like they'd been broken off trees, not fallen naturally. Our car had 3 dents in the hood, a cracked windshield, and scratches all down one side. But the worst part was the footprints. We found them in a few muddy spots around our campsite. They were huge, easily 16 inches long and incredibly deep, like whatever made them was massively heavy. They looked almost human, but not quite. The toes were wrong and they were just too big. We never went camping there again. Mike and I split up a few months later for unrelated reasons, but I know that night changed something in both of us. Zeus was never the same either. He refused to go into the woods after that, and he'd get extremely agitated whenever he heard any kind of siren or loud, sustained noise. I've spent countless hours since then researching similar encounters in the Mark Twain National Forest area. There have been other reports, but nothing quite like what we experienced. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some kind of territorial animal, maybe we were just scared and imagining things. But then I remember how Zeus reacted. Dogs don't imagine things. They don't make up fears. Whatever was out there that night was real, and it was something our 120-pound fearless guard dog wanted absolutely nothing to do with. I still can't explain what happened that night. I don't know what was out there, and part of me doesn't want to know. All I know is that something intelligent and powerful enough to throw rocks and branches with incredible force was toying with us that night. And when we played that Bigfoot call, it understood exactly what we were doing and responded with aggression. I've never felt so small and vulnerable in my life. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I hear that scream again. Zeus passed away last winter, but until his last day, he never set foot in another forest. I guess some instincts are worth listening to. Story 3. I had set up camp about 2 miles downstream from the main recreational area, in a spot I'd been using for years. It's a secluded location, accessible by a rough dirt road that requires a 4x4 to navigate. My girlfriend Sarah and I had planned to stay for a week, hunting wild hogs that had been causing problems in the area. We'd parked my F-150 on a flat piece of ground about 30 yards from the river, with our tent set up nearby under a large oak tree. The first few days were pretty routine. We'd been seeing lots of wild hog signs, torn up ground, tracks near the river, broken branches. What caught our attention was this massive sow, must have been around 500 pounds, moving through the area with several piglets. We'd see them mainly in the evenings, rooting around the edges of our campsite. Being experienced with wild hogs, we kept our distance and made sure our food was secured in the truck. Everything changed on our 4th night. The temperature had dropped to around 45 degrees, and there was this thick fog coming off the river. We were sitting in camp chairs by a small fire around 9:30 p.m. when we heard the familiar sound of hogs approaching. The big sow and her piglets had become pretty regular visitors by then, so we weren't too concerned. We could see their dark shapes moving through the underbrush about 20 yards from camp, doing their usual foraging. That's when everything went dead silent. And I mean dead silent. No crickets, no frogs from the river, nothing. Every hair on my body stood up. Even the hogs froze in place. There was this pressure in the air, like right before a massive storm. Sarah grabbed my arm and pointed toward the ravine about 50 yards to our left. The smell hit us first. It was unlike anything I'd ever encountered, a mix between rotting meat, wet dog, and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Then we heard it, a sound that still haunts my dreams. It started as this low moan, almost below what you could hear, but you could feel it in your chest. Then it began to rise in pitch, getting louder and higher until it turned into this blood-curdling scream. The sound echoed off the ravine walls, and I swear to God, it made my truck vibrate. The screech lasted for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10, 15 seconds before dropping into this deep, guttural roar that sounded like a grizzly bear being amplified through a megaphone. The hogs absolutely lost it. The big sow let out this terrified squeal, and her piglets scattered in all directions. She took off, crashing through the underbrush like something was chasing her. I've never seen wild hogs panic like that. These are animals that usually stand their ground against anything. Sarah and I were frozen in place. That's when the rocks started hitting the truck. Not pebbles, I'm talking about rocks the size of softballs. They were coming from the direction of the ravine, but in the darkness and fog, we couldn't see what was throwing them. The impacts were leaving dents in my truck's body. One hit the driver's side window and cracked it. Then the wood started flying. Branches and chunks of logs, some of them pretty big. One piece, must have been 4 feet long and thick as my arm, sailed over our heads and crashed into our tent, collapsing it. Whatever was throwing these things was incredibly strong. I grabbed my rifle from the truck, a .30, 06 I use for hunting. But my hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold it. The smell was getting stronger, and we could hear heavy footsteps moving through the woods. Not like a bear or a hog. These were bipedal steps, heavy enough to make the ground vibrate slightly. That's when we saw it. Through the fog and darkness, about 30 yards away, this massive shape moved between 2 trees. I'm 6'2", and these trees were mature oaks. This thing was a good 3 feet taller than me, with incredibly broad shoulders. It was covered in what looked like dark hair. The way it moved was wrong. Fluid, but powerful, like an athlete, but much bigger than any human could be. What really got me were the eyes. We could see them reflecting our fire's light. They were set high up, way above where a bear's would be, and they had this reddish-amber glow. The intelligence in them, it wasn't animal-like at all. It was watching us, studying us. Sarah whispered, "Bill, we need to go, now." Her voice was trembling. I've never heard her that scared, and she's handled mountain lion encounters before. I kept my rifle trained on the shape while Sarah got in the passenger side. The creature hadn't moved, but we could hear wood cracking as it gripped a tree trunk. The smell was overwhelming now, making us gag. I backed toward the driver's side, never taking my eyes off those glowing orbs. As I reached for the door handle, the thing took a step forward into a slightly clearer area. The sight of it moving into that space, it was like my brain couldn't properly process what I was seeing. The proportions were all wrong for any known animal. The arms were too long, hanging down past its knees. The head seemed to sit directly on its shoulders, with no visible neck. I got in the truck and fired it up. The headlights illuminated the area where the creature had been, but it had stepped back into the shadows. As I threw the truck into reverse, it let out another one of those screams, this one so loud and close it felt like my eardrums would burst. I backed up until I could turn around, then gunned it down that rough trail, not caring about the damage I might do to my suspension. The whole time, we could hear crashing through the woods parallel to us, keeping pace with the truck for at least a quarter mile before the sounds faded. We drove straight to my buddy Mike's house about 15 miles away. He said we both looked like we'd seen a ghost. When we went back the next day with Mike and his son to get our camping gear, the site was a mess. Our tent was destroyed, and there were branches and rocks scattered everywhere. But what really shook me were the tracks. They were huge, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. They showed clear toe impressions and a distinct arch, like a giant human footprint. They were deep, too, maybe 2 inches into the hard soil. Whatever made them had to weigh at least 600 pounds. Mike took some photos, but they don't really do justice to what we saw. The weirdest thing? Those hogs, which had been a constant presence in the area, completely disappeared. Local hunters reported not seeing any sign of them for weeks afterward. It was like they abandoned their entire territory in a single night. I've spent my whole life outdoors. I've encountered bears, mountain lions, and all sorts of wildlife. I never believed in Bigfoot, thought it was all stories and hoaxes. But what we experienced that night, there's no explanation that fits except one, and I'm still having trouble accepting it. I haven't been back to that camping spot since, and I don't plan to. Some things you see change you forever, and that night by Big Piney River was one of them. The dents in my truck and that cracked window stayed there for months as a reminder. I've fixed them now, But sometimes when I'm driving at night, I catch myself looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those eyes again. I don't talk about this much because most people wouldn't believe it, but I know what I saw, what I heard, what I smelled, and I know somewhere out in those woods something is out there that shouldn't exist, but does. Story 4. I've been hunting in the Ozark National Forest near Pine Grove, Arkansas for over 20 years, but what happened on October 12, 2019 still keeps me up at night. I'm writing this down because I need to get it off my chest, and maybe someone out there has seen something similar. I arrived at my usual hunting spot around 3:45 a.m. It was a cool morning, probably around 45 degrees, with a light fog hanging close to the ground. I've got a permanent tree stand about 20 feet up an old oak tree that I've been using for the past 5 seasons. It's in a perfect spot where several game trails converge in a small clearing about 3 miles from the nearest access road. I got settled in my stand and set up my gear like I always do. My Remington 700.30-06, my rangefinder, and my new ATN X-Sight 4K Pro Night Vision Scope that I'd invested in that season. The moon was only a quarter full, but with the night vision, I could see pretty clearly out to about 150 yards. Around 4:30 a.m., everything changed. I know the exact time because I just checked my phone to see how long until sunrise. The woods got quiet, and I mean absolutely silent. If you hunt, you know that's not normal. There's always something making noise, whether it's crickets, owls, or the wind in the trees. But this was different. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the forest. At first, I thought it might be a mountain lion. We get them sometimes in this area, and they can definitely spook the local wildlife into silence. But then I heard it, the sound of branches breaking. Not the quick snap you get when a deer steps on a dead branch, but slow, deliberate breaks, like someone snapping a baseball bat in half, but slowly. The sound came from about 100 yards to my northwest. I raised my rifle to use the night vision scope, and that's when my hands started shaking. Through the green glow of the scope, I saw something moving between the trees. At first, my brain tried to make it into a bear standing up, but bears don't walk like that. This thing was walking upright, methodically moving from tree to tree like it was searching for something. The creature had to be at least 7 feet tall. I'm good at estimating height because I've been doing construction work for 25 years. Its shoulders were massive, easily twice the width of a large man. The way it moved was what really got to me. It wasn't clumsy or awkward like a bear on its hind legs. This thing moved smoothly, purposefully, like it knew exactly what it was doing. Then the smell hit me. I've field-dressed hundreds of deer and dealt with all kinds of wild animal carcasses, but this was different. It was like rotting meat mixed with wet dog and something else I can't even describe. The smell was so strong it made my eyes water. Through my scope, I watched it stop at several spots, bend down, and examine the ground. It would pick something up occasionally, but I couldn't make out what. Its movements were almost human-like, but just wrong enough to send chills down my spine. The hair on its body was dark, not black, but a deep brown, and it looked matted in some places. I wanted to leave. Everything in my body was screaming at me to get down from that tree stand and run. But I knew that would be the worst thing I could do. I was stuck there, trying not to make a sound, watching this thing through my scope. Around 5:15 a.m., I heard the deer. A group of them must have been bedded down about 70 yards to my east, because suddenly they all burst out of their spot, crashing through the underbrush in complete panic. I've never seen deer move like that. Not even when running from coyotes or mountain lions. This was pure terror. The creature's head snapped toward the sound of the fleeing deer. That's when I got my clearest look at its face. The night vision made everything green, but I could still make out the details. Its face was somewhere between ape and human, with deep-set eyes under a prominent brow ridge. The nose was flat and wide, and its mouth seemed to be set in a permanent scowl. As the sky started lightening around 6 a.m., the creature became more agitated. It started moving faster, less carefully. It made this sound, not quite a growl, not quite a grunt, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Then it just disappeared into a particularly dense patch of vegetation about 80 yards from my stand. I stayed in that tree for another hour after sunrise, my rifle trained on that spot where it vanished. When I finally got up the courage to climb down, my legs were shaking so bad I nearly fell. I didn't want to go look for tracks, but I knew I had to. I needed to prove to myself that what I saw was real. The ground was soft from rain earlier in the week, and the tracks were there, clear as day. I took pictures of them with my phone next to my size 11 boot for scale. The prints were huge, easily 16 inches long. They were humanoid but wider, with 5 distinct toes. The stride length between prints was over 6 feet. What really got me was the depth of the impressions. Whatever made these tracks had to weigh at least 500 pounds to sink that deep into the soil. I spent another 30 minutes looking around the area where I'd seen it searching. I found broken branches about 8 feet up on some trees. Broken downward, not the way deer or elk break branches. There were also some odd scrape marks on a few tree trunks, too high up to be from any normal wildlife. I've been back to hunt that spot twice since then, both times during regular daylight hours. I haven't seen anything unusual, but I can't shake the feeling of being watched. I haven't told many people about this. My wife knows, and a couple of close hunting buddies, but that's it. They probably think I'm crazy or that I dozed off in my stand and dreamed the whole thing. But those tracks were real. I've got the pictures, though they don't do justice to what it felt like standing there, measuring them, trying to rationalize what could have made them. I've hunted all my life, tracked every kind of animal in these woods, and I've never seen anything like this. The thing that really bothers me isn't just what I saw, it's how it behaved. This wasn't some animal acting on instinct. Whatever I watched that morning was intelligent. It was searching for something specific. It was aware of its surroundings in a way that seemed almost human, but at the same time completely alien. I still hunt, but not in that spot, and never alone anymore. I've got my night vision equipment packed away in my garage, haven't used it since that morning. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I can still smell that awful stench, and I wonder what would have happened if that thing had noticed me up in that tree. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. I've looked up every possible animal it could have been, every rational explanation, but nothing fits. All I know is that something is out there in those woods that shouldn't exist, something that's smart enough to stay hidden and strong enough to snap thick branches like twigs. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can hear those same slow, deliberate branch breaks in the distance, even though I'm miles away from those woods. Story 5. This happened in late September 2021. My wife Sarah and I had taken our kids, Tommy 12 and Emma 9, camping near Hayo Creek, about 15 miles outside of town. We'd found this secluded spot off South Fork Road that seemed perfect, right by the water, surrounded by old-growth forest. The area was beautiful, with huge Douglas firs and plenty of flat ground for our tent. We'd been there 2 nights already without any issues. That third night changed everything. We'd had a normal evening, roasted hot dogs and s'mores, told some stories around the campfire, nothing unusual. Before bed, I made sure our coolers and food boxes were secured like always. We keep them about 30 feet from the tent, tied to a tree with rope, standard precaution against bears in the area. The kids fell asleep quickly after our busy day of hiking and swimming. I remember checking my watch when the first noise woke me, 3:07 a.m. At first I thought it was a raccoon or maybe a bear messing with our food storage. There was this weird shuffling sound, different from what you'd expect from typical wildlife. It was more deliberate. The movement sounded heavy but careful, like something big trying to be quiet. The thing that really got me was the breathing. Even from inside the tent I could hear these deep, rhythmic breaths, not like a bear's snuffling. This was slower, almost human-like, but much deeper than any person could make. Sarah was awake too by this point, gripping my arm. We could hear whatever it was methodically going through our supplies. I knew I had to check it out. We had practically all our food out there, and we were miles from the nearest help. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight, one of those big LED ones that could light up half a football field. Sarah whispered, "Don't," but I figured I needed to at least scare off whatever it was. The moment I unzipped the tent, everything went dead silent. The normal forest sounds, crickets, frogs by the creek, had already been quiet, but now even the shuffling stopped. Just complete, oppressive silence, the kind that makes your ears ring. I stepped out slowly, trying to keep my movements quiet. The September air was crisp, probably mid-40s, but I was sweating. Our campsite was dimly lit by the quarter moon, just enough to make out basic shapes. I could see our food storage area was disturbed. One cooler was tipped over, contents scattered. When I pointed my flashlight in that direction, my whole body went cold. There was this figure crouched over our supplies. In that first second, my brain tried to rationalize it as a bear, but I knew immediately this was something else. Its proportions were all wrong. When the light hit it, it didn't bolt like a startled animal would. Instead, it slowly, so slowly, began to stand up. That's what got me. No wild animal behaves that way. They either freeze or run. This thing's movement was deliberate, almost like it was trying to intimidate us. As it stood to its full height, I felt my knees go weak. This thing was massive, at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. It towered over our food storage area. The body was covered in dark, matted hair, not fur like a bear, but longer, more human-like hair. In the flashlight beam, I could see it was a deep brown-black color with silvery patches on its shoulders, but its eyes, God, its eyes. When my light hit them, they reflected back this deep reddish glow. Not the usual green eye shine you get from most animals. This was different, almost like burning coals. And they were set in this face that was just wrong. Not quite ape, definitely not bear. The face had this distinct brow ridge, and the eyes were deep-set but undeniably intelligent. We just stood there, frozen in this horrible standoff. I could hear Sarah crying softly in the tent, trying to keep the kids quiet. They were awake now, but thankfully staying still. The creature's breathing was even more apparent now, deep, controlled breaths that you could feel more than hear. The smell hit me then, this overwhelming musky odor, like wet dog mixed with something rotting and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. The creature just kept staring, not making any aggressive moves, but not backing down either. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Probably only a few minutes, but it felt like hours. My arm was shaking from holding up the flashlight, but I didn't dare lower it. The creature slowly tilted its head, almost like it was studying us. Then it did something that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. It slowly raised one massive hand, fingers splayed, in what almost looked like a gesture of recognition, warning. I don't know. Then, without any warning, it just turned and walked into the forest. Not running, not crashing through the brush like a spooked animal. It walked, bipedally, with this smooth gait that was disturbingly human-like. The trees in that area are huge, old-growth stuff, but this thing was so tall its head was up near the lower branches. We could hear it moving away for several minutes, branches softly creaking, occasional snaps of twigs. Then nothing. The normal forest sounds didn't return for what felt like hours. We stayed in the tent the rest of the night, completely sleepless, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally came, I went to check the damage. Our food was scattered everywhere, but the weird thing was how methodical it seemed. The cooler hadn't been ripped open like a bear would do. The latches were carefully opened. Packages were torn neatly at the seams. Whatever this thing was, it had dexterity and intelligence. I found footprints too, though the ground was pretty hard. What prints I could see were massive, easily 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. The stride length between prints was huge, over 4 feet apart. I tried to take pictures, but my hands were shaking so bad they all came out blurry. We packed up and left as soon as we could get our stuff together. Didn't even eat breakfast. The whole drive home, nobody said a word. What could we say? We'd all seen something that shouldn't exist. I reported it to the Forest Service, but you can imagine how that went. They logged it as a possible bear encounter, but I've been hunting in these woods for 20 years. I know what bears look like, how they move, how they behave. This was something else entirely. We haven't been camping since then. The kids still have nightmares sometimes. I find myself avoiding the woods now, especially at night. I keep replaying that encounter in my mind, trying to make sense of it. That deliberate movement, those eyes, that almost human gesture. Sometimes I wish it had just been aggressive, acted like a wild animal. That would have been easier to process than the intelligence I saw in those eyes. I know how this story sounds. If someone had told me this 3 years ago, I would have thought they were making it up or had seen a bear in bad lighting. But I know what I saw. My whole family saw it. And sometimes, late at night, I still wake up thinking I can hear those deep, controlled breaths outside my window, even though I know I'm miles from those woods. Story 6. I've been a farmer in Newcomerstown, Ohio for nearly 20 years now. What happened on my property in late September 2018 still gives me chills, and I finally decided to share it. I know how this might sound, but every word I'm about to tell you is true. It started on a Monday morning. I was doing my usual rounds, checking on the apple and pear orchards I maintain on the east side of my property. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and there was still a bit of fog hanging low over the fields. Something felt off right away. As I got closer to the orchard, I noticed several of my trees were practically destroyed. I'm not talking about normal damage from deer or bears. These were mature trees with trunks nearly a foot thick, and they were bent and broken like twigs. What really got to me were the claw marks. They were gouged deep into the bark, higher than I could reach even with my arms stretched up. I'm 6'2", and these marks were a good 9 feet off the ground. Some of the branches were twisted off, not just broken, and there were half-eaten pears and apples scattered everywhere. The weird thing was, they weren't eaten like how a bear would eat them. They were crushed, like something had just squeezed them until they burst. I've dealt with all kinds of wildlife damage over the years, but this was different. The destruction was methodical, almost deliberate. I called the local game warden, but they just said it was probably black bears, even though we rarely get them around here. They didn't even come out to look. That night, my horses started acting strange. I've got 4 quarter horses that I keep in the barn about 200 yards from my house. They're usually pretty calm, but that evening they were completely on edge. When I went to check on them around dusk, they were huddled in the back of their stalls, sweating and snorting. They flat out refused to come out, even when I tried to lead them to the pasture. I've never seen them act like that before. The same thing happened the next 2 nights. Each evening, right around sunset, the horses would get extremely agitated. They'd kick their stall doors, whinny, and work themselves up into a complete frenzy. The weird thing was, my dogs, I've got 2 German shepherds, were acting strange too. Instead of barking like they normally would if there was a coyote or stranger around, they just whimpered and stayed close to the house. By Thursday night, I was on edge myself. I hadn't been sleeping well, constantly waking up to check on the animals. Around 11 p.m., I was sitting in my living room with all the lights off, just watching the property through my window. The moon was nearly full, so I had a decent view of the barn and the edge of the woods beyond it. That's when I heard it. At first, it was like a low rumble, almost like a semi-truck engine idling in the distance. But then it changed into something I can't really describe. A sound that was somehow between a roar and a scream. It was deep, way deeper than any animal I've ever heard, but at the same time, it had this almost human quality to it that made my skin crawl. It was so powerful that the windows started vibrating in their frames. I grabbed my phone and started recording. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it. The sound lasted for maybe 45 seconds, but it felt like forever. It seemed to be coming from the tree line behind the barn, maybe 300 yards from my house. The horses were going absolutely crazy in the barn, and I could hear them kicking the walls. When the sound finally stopped, there was this unnatural silence. No crickets, no nothing, just dead quiet. I stayed by the window, scanning the tree line with a spotlight, but I couldn't see anything moving. Around 2 a.m. I must have dozed off in my chair. The next morning, I went out at first light to check on the horses. They were still agitated but calmer than the night before. That's when I saw them. The footprints. They were everywhere around the barn, in the soft dirt where I'd been grading for a new gravel path. My blood ran cold when I really looked at them. These weren't bear tracks. They weren't anything I'd ever seen before. They were clearly footprints, but massive, easily 15 inches long. They showed 5 distinct toes and had this arch to them, almost like a human foot, but way bigger. The stride length between them was huge, at least 6 feet apart in some places. Whatever made them had walked all around the barn, and there was even a clear spot where it had apparently stood for a while, because the prints were deeper there. I took pictures and measurements of everything. I even made some plaster casts of the best prints. The game warden still wouldn't come out, and I don't blame them. Who would want to file that report? The strange thing is, after that night, everything just stopped. The horses calmed down. No more trees were damaged, and I haven't heard that sound again. But I've noticed other small things. Sometimes I'll find strange hair caught on my fence posts, way too high up for any normal animal. Every once in a while, I'll get that feeling of being watched when I'm out working near the woods. And on really quiet nights, sometimes I swear I can hear wood knocking coming from deep in the forest. I still have the video on my phone of that scream, and the plaster casts are in my garage. I've played that recording for a few people, and they all say the same thing. They've never heard anything like it. I've lived around these parts my whole life, and I know every animal sound there is. This was something else entirely. I'm not saying I know what was on my property that week. I'm not claiming anything specific. All I know is that something big enough to break mature fruit trees, something that left 15-inch footprints and made a sound that could shake windows, spent several nights around my farm. And whatever it was smart enough to know when to leave. I still farm the same land, still tend to my horses and orchards, but I don't stay out after dark anymore, and I've installed more security lights around the property. Some things you just can't explain, and maybe some things are better left unexplained. But I know what I experienced, and I know those nights changed how I think about what might be out there in those woods. The weirdest part? Last month I found another set of those prints, just a single trail of them, leading from the woods to my orchard and back. They were exactly the same size as the ones from 2018. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, watching, waiting. Maybe it never really left at all. Story 7. I've been hesitating to share this for over a year now, but what my buddy Mike and I saw that night in Warrenton still haunts me. I'm a commercial fisherman by trade, been fishing the Columbia River for nearly 2 decades, but this wasn't during work hours. This happened during one of our regular night fishing sessions we do for fun, just trying to catch some salmon for ourselves back in late September 2022. It was around 11:30 p.m. on a surprisingly clear night. The moon was nearly full and the water was calm, perfect conditions for night fishing. We were at this spot about 2 miles downstream from Hammond, where the river makes a slight bend. It's a good spot we've been using for years, kind of secluded, with a gentle slope down to the water. The riverbank there has these patches of tall grass and a few scattered trees, nothing too dense. The fishing had been great that night. We'd already landed 3 decent-sized Chinooks, and the fish were really active. The tide was coming in, and we could see the water level slowly rising up the bank. The temperature was around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, pretty mild for that time of year, with just a light breeze coming off the river. I remember checking my phone just before it happened, thinking about calling it a night since we'd had such good luck. That's when the first weird thing occurred. The fish just stopped biting, like completely stopped. If you fish regularly, you know how sometimes the action just dies down. But this was different. It was like someone had flipped a switch. One minute our lines were getting hits, and the next, absolute nothing. At first, I didn't think much of it. I was rebaiting my hook when Mike nudged my arm. He didn't say anything, just pointed across the river. I followed his gesture, and that's when I saw it. About 150 yards upstream from us, something massive was entering the water from the opposite bank. In all my years on the river, I've seen bears, elk, and all sorts of wildlife, but this was something else entirely. The moonlight was hitting it perfectly, and I could see its outline clear as day. This thing was huge. I'm talking at least 8 feet tall, maybe even taller. It wasn't bulky like a bear standing up. It had this athletic, almost human-like build, but much, much bigger. The way it moved through the water was what really got me. It wasn't splashing or struggling like an animal would. Its movements were deliberate, almost graceful. The water was probably chest-deep for it, but it moved through it like it was nothing. And here's the detail that still makes my skin crawl. It was carrying something. In one of its arms, it had what looked like a large salmon. The fish had to be at least 30 pounds, and this thing was holding it like I'd hold a loaf of bread. Mike and I just stood there, completely frozen. Neither of us said a word. We couldn't. The creature moved across the river in this smooth, steady pace. Its fur, and I'm certain it was fur, looked dark and sleek in the moonlight. It wasn't shaggy like a bear's coat. It seemed more uniform, almost well-kept, if that makes any sense. The strangest part? The absolute silence. No splashing, no grunting, no sounds at all. Just this massive figure gliding through the water. The only noise was the gentle lapping of the river against the banks. Even the usual night sounds, the frogs, the insects, everything had gone quiet. I remember wanting to grab my phone to take a video, but I couldn't move. It was like my brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. The whole thing lasted maybe 45 seconds, but it felt like time had stopped. We watched as it reached the other side of the river and disappeared into the darkness beyond the bank. After it was gone, Mike and I just looked at each other. What do you say after seeing something like that? We waited maybe another 15 minutes, but the fish never started biting again. There was this heavy feeling in the air, like the whole atmosphere had changed. We packed up our gear quickly and got out of there. The drive home was mostly silent. What could we really say? We both knew what we'd seen, but it didn't make any sense. I've been an outdoorsman my whole life, spent countless nights on that river, but nothing prepared me for this. The image of that creature moving through the water, carrying that fish, it's burned into my memory. I've thought about reporting it, but to who? The local authorities? Fish and wildlife? Who's going to believe two guys saw what was clearly, well, what everyone calls Bigfoot, casually crossing the Columbia River with its dinner? We didn't have any proof. No photos, no videos, no footprints. The rocky riverbank wouldn't show any. Just our story. The weirdest part is how it's affected me since then. I still fish that river. It's my livelihood after all, but I won't go night fishing anymore. Not in that spot. I keep thinking about how many times I might have been out there, in the dark, with that thing nearby, and never known it. The river feels different now, bigger somehow, more mysterious. Mike and I have only talked about it a few times since then. He moved to Astoria last spring, but whenever we meet up, there's this unspoken understanding between us. We know what we saw that night wasn't a bear, wasn't an elk, wasn't anything that's supposed to exist in Oregon. Sometimes I wonder about that salmon it was carrying. Was it one it caught itself? Had it been watching us fish? Was it fishing somewhere upstream? These questions keep nagging at me, but I know I'll never have answers. All I know is what I saw that night changed how I think about these stories, about what's really out there in the dark. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I know how this sounds. Believe me, I do. If someone had told me this story a few years ago, I probably wouldn't have believed them either. But I know what I saw. That massive figure in the moonlight, moving through the water with such purpose, such ease. It was real. Whatever it was real. The river's different for me now. During the day, when I'm out on my boat working, everything feels normal. But sometimes, when the light hits the water just right, or when I pass by that bend in the river, I can't help but scan the banks. I'm not sure if I'm hoping to see it again, or hoping I don't. Story 8. It started in early June 2020. With all the COVID restrictions in place, I figured it was the perfect time to work on my personal project documenting the wildlife around the less-traveled areas of Summersville Lake. There's this secluded spot about 3 miles from the main recreation area where a natural spring creates a small pool that attracts all sorts of wildlife. I'd been tracking deer, bears, and other animals there for years. I set up 3 trail cameras around the spring, high-quality ones with motion sensors and night vision capabilities. These weren't cheap. We're talking about $200-300 each. I carefully positioned them at different angles to maximize coverage. One facing the approach from the dense forest, another overlooking the spring itself, and a third covering the small clearing nearby. I marked their locations on my GPS and made detailed notes of their positions and angles. The first week went fine. I got some decent footage of deer, raccoons, and even a black bear. But when I went to check the cameras the following Monday morning, something was off. The camera facing the forest had been turned 90 degrees to the left. At first, I thought it might have been knocked by a bear. It's happened before. I repositioned it and checked the footage, but the memory card showed nothing unusual before going dark around 2 a.m. The second week is when things got weird. I hiked out there early Monday morning, and this time 2 of the cameras were completely face down in the dirt. The third one was still in place, but had deep scratches across its case. My hands were shaking as I picked them up. These cameras were secured with heavy-duty straps designed to withstand bears. Whatever did this had to be incredibly strong and deliberate in its actions. The footage showed the same pattern, everything normal until around 2:30 a.m., then nothing. By the third week, I was determined to figure out what was happening. I reinforced the camera mounts with steel cables and added some extra security features. I even sprayed them with a special coating that would make them harder for animals to grip. When I returned that Monday, my heart sank. One camera was completely crushed, like something had squeezed it until it broke. Another was missing entirely. I never found it. The third one was hanging by its cable, swinging in the breeze. I almost gave up then. These cameras weren't cheap, and I was running out of equipment. But curiosity got the better of me. For the fourth week, I went all out. I set up my best camera, a $500 Reconix Hyperfire Professional coated in scent eliminator, mounted it 12 feet high on a thick oak tree, and disguised it with local vegetation. I also set up a cellular link so it would send images directly to my phone. At 2:17 a.m. that Thursday, my phone started buzzing with notifications. What I saw in those images still makes my skin crawl. The first few shots showed something massive moving in the darkness. The infrared sensor caught glimpses of thick, dark fur. Then came the image that haunts me, a huge, hairy arm reaching up toward the camera. The fur was a deep brown black, matted in some places but thick and wild in others. The hand. God, the hand. It had 5 fingers like a human hand, but massive, with thick knuckles and dirty, worn nails. The proportions were all wrong, too big, too muscular for any bear. The next morning, I forced myself to go back. The camera was still there but mangled, hanging by its cable. But what really got to me were the tracks. The ground was still soft from recent rain, and there they were. Footprints unlike anything I'd ever seen. They were huge, easily 16 inches long, with 5 toes clearly visible in the mud. They weren't bear tracks. I've seen plenty of those. These were different. The stride length between prints was enormous, suggesting whatever made them was walking upright. I took photos and measurements of everything, made plaster casts of the prints. But when I tried to show local authorities, they just smiled politely and suggested it was probably bear damage. They didn't even want to look at the image from my camera. The thing is, I'm not some conspiracy theorist or attention seeker. I'm a professional who spent countless hours in the woods. I know what bears can do. I know what other wildlife is capable of. This was different. Whatever was out there seemed intelligent, deliberate, and incredibly strong. It didn't just randomly damage my cameras. It systematically disabled my attempt to photograph it. I haven't set up any more cameras at that spring. Sometimes I think about going back, trying again with better equipment. But then I remember that hand reaching for the camera, those fingers that look too human yet not human at all, and I stay away. The image is still saved on my phone, but it's blurry and partial, just enough to make out the massive arm and hand, but not enough to convince skeptics. The most unnerving part? When I talk to some of the old-timers in Summersville, they just nod knowingly. One elderly man at the local diner told me they've been hearing strange calls from those woods for generations. He mentioned stories of hunters' camps being ransacked, of strange shadows moving through the trees at night, of footprints found in places where no human could have reached. I still do wildlife photography, but I'm more cautious now. I pay attention to that feeling when the forest goes quiet, when the birds stop singing, when the air feels heavy with something watching. Sometimes, when I'm processing my photos at night, I find myself staring at that last image, that massive hand reaching toward my camera, and wondering what would have happened if I'd been there instead of just my equipment. The strangest thing is how it just stopped. After that 4th week, there were no more incidents, no more destroyed cameras, though I haven't put any back in that specific location, no more strange encounters. It's like whatever it was just moved on, leaving me with nothing but questions, a few blurry photos, and a story that most people don't believe. I've spent countless hours researching similar incidents in the area, trying to make sense of what happened. There are other reports, though most people won't talk about them publicly. The five-fingered prints seem to be a common thread. Too human-like to be a bear, too large to be a person. I've learned to be careful who I share this with. Most people just write it off as imagination or misleading evidence. But I know what I saw. I have the photos of those prints, that one haunting image of the hand, and the memory of how the forest felt different during those weeks, like it was holding its breath, hiding something that didn't want to be found. Sometimes I dream about going back to that spring with better equipment, maybe a team of people. But something tells me that whatever was there wouldn't show itself again. It was too deliberate, too intelligent in how it handled my cameras. All I know is that there are things in those woods that defy explanation, and sometimes the best evidence is the kind that gets destroyed before anyone else can see it. Story 9. I've been driving trucks for over 15 years, and what happened to me last summer in Tennessee still keeps me up at night sometimes. I've never shared this story publicly before, but I need to get it off my chest. I know how this is going to sound, but every word I'm about to tell you is true. It was around 2 a.m. on July 23, 2019. I was hauling a load from Nashville to Knoxville on I-40, and I was fighting to keep my eyes open. I'd been driving since early afternoon, and even though I technically had a few more hours left in my log, I knew I needed to stop before I got too drowsy. When I saw the sign for a rest area coming up just east of Lebanon, I decided to pull in and catch a few hours of sleep. The rest area was one of those older ones that's basically just a large parking lot surrounded by woods. There were only two other vehicles there, another semi-parked way at the other end, and what looked like an old pickup truck. I pulled into a spot near the middle, facing the tree line. The night was humid, typical Tennessee summer weather, and there was this heavy mist hanging in the air, making the whole place feel even more isolated than it already was. I remember checking my phone. It was exactly 2:07 a.m. I always note these details because of DOT regulations. The parking lot lights were working, but they were those old yellowish ones that don't really illuminate much beyond their immediate area. I had just turned off my engine and was about to climb into my sleeper berth when I noticed movement in my driver's side mirror. At first, I thought it was just another driver heading to the restroom building, but something about the movement caught my attention. It was too fluid, too different. When I focused on the mirror, that's when I saw it. There was this massive figure methodically going through one of the garbage bins near the edge of the parking lot, maybe 50 feet from my truck. The thing that immediately struck me was its size. I've been around long enough to be able to gauge distances and heights pretty accurately. You develop that skill when you're constantly checking clearances. This, whatever it was, had to be at least 7 feet tall, probably closer to 8. And it wasn't just tall, it was massive. The shoulders were probably twice the width of a regular person's. I sat there frozen, trying to process what I was seeing. The creature was moving with purpose, almost like it knew exactly what it was looking for in that trash bin. Its arms were incredibly long, and even in the dim light, I could see the dark hair covering its entire body. It wasn't like a bear's fur, it was more like a dense, matted coat. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I've encountered bears before at rest stops. It's not uncommon in some areas, but this was different. The way it moved was just wrong for a bear. Too upright, too deliberate. And those proportions, no bear has proportions like that. Without really thinking it through, I did probably the dumbest thing possible. I hit the high beams. I needed to see it clearly. I needed to know I wasn't imagining things. The moment those lights came on, the creature's head snapped toward my truck with a speed that made my blood run cold. That's when I saw its face, and that's the image that's burned into my memory. The eyes. They caught the light and reflected it back with this intense reddish-orange glow, like a cat's eyes but much larger. The face was somewhat flat, almost human-like, but definitely not human. It had this prominent brow ridge, and the jaw seemed massive. But what really got me was its reaction. It didn't run away immediately like a startled animal would. It stood up to its full height, and God, it was enormous. And for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2-3 seconds, it just stared at me. I could see its muscles tensing under that dark hair. The build was just incredible, not fat like a bear, but muscular, like a bodybuilder covered in hair. Then it moved, and let me tell you, nothing that big should be able to move that fast. In 2 strides, it crossed the distance to the tree line. The way it moved, it was like watching an Olympic athlete, but scaled up to impossible proportions. It disappeared into the woods, and I swear I could hear the cracking of branches and undergrowth for several seconds afterward. I sat there for what must have been at least 15 minutes, just staring at the spot where it vanished. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my phone to check the time. The whole encounter probably lasted less than 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. The weird thing is what happened next, or rather, what didn't happen. There was this absolute silence. If you've ever been in the woods at night, you know there's always some noise, crickets, frogs, something. But there was nothing, just this heavy, oppressive quiet that seemed to press in from all sides. I couldn't bring myself to get out of the cab, but I didn't feel safe enough to sleep either. I started up my truck and got back on the road, safety hours be damned. I drove straight through to the next major truck stop, about 40 miles down I-40. The next day, I went back to that rest area in the daylight. I don't know what I expected to find, but I had to look. The trash bin was still there, but it was standing upright like nothing had happened. I did notice some broken branches at the edge of the woods, but in all honesty, those could have been from anything. I've heard all the stories about Bigfoot over the years, seen the TV shows, and always thought it was just entertainment. But after that night, I don't know anymore. I'm not claiming I saw Bigfoot. I honestly don't know what I saw. But I know what I saw wasn't normal, wasn't human, and wasn't any kind of animal I've ever encountered in my years on the road. What really sticks with me isn't just the size or the speed of the thing. It's the intelligence I saw in those eyes during those few seconds when it stared at me. There was something aware in that gaze, something that knew exactly what it was looking at. That's what keeps me up at night sometimes. I still drive that route regularly. It's a major trucking corridor. But I never stop at that rest area anymore, not even during the day. And every time I pass it at night, I find myself checking my mirrors a little more carefully, wondering if something's watching from those woods. I've never had another experience like that night, and part of me hopes I never will. But I know what I saw, even if I can't explain it. I've heard there have been other sightings in that area over the years, but I've never looked into them. Honestly, I'm not sure I want to know. Some of my fellow drivers have noticed I won't stop at that rest area anymore, and a few have asked why. I usually just make up something about the parking being bad or the facilities being run down. It's easier than trying to explain what really happened. How do you tell someone you saw something that shouldn't exist? The strangest part is how normal everything else was that night. The weather, the traffic, the job. It was just another summer night run until it wasn't. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else at that rest area saw what I saw. There were those other vehicles there, but I never saw any signs of their drivers. Did they see it too? Or were they sleeping through the whole thing? I'm not asking anyone to believe me. Hell, some days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw that night in Lebanon, and I know that whatever it wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't supposed to exist at all. Yet there it was, digging through a trash bin at a Tennessee rest stop like it was the most natural thing in the world. These days I keep a dash cam running all the time, just in case. Not that I expect to see anything like that again, but, well, you never know. And if by some chance anyone else has seen something similar in that area, I'd sure like to know about it. Not that it would change anything, but at least I'd know I'm not crazy. That's my story. Take it for what it's worth. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm just telling you what happened to me that night. What you choose to believe is up to you. Story 10. I've been a forest ranger in the Reedsport area of Oregon for almost 15 years now, and what I experienced in late September 2021 still keeps me up at night. I'm writing this down because I need to get it off my chest, and maybe someone out there has seen something similar. September 23rd started like any other day on patrol. I was doing my usual rounds in the dense forest land about 8 miles east of Reedsport, checking on some reported illegal camping sites. The morning was unusually quiet, with a heavy fog that hadn't burned off yet, despite it being around 10 a.m. The moisture in the air made everything smell stronger, that rich, earthy scent of decomposing leaves and damp bark that's so typical of Oregon forests. I'd parked my truck at one of our service roads and was walking one of the less traveled paths when something caught my eye. At first I thought it was just storm damage. We'd had some heavy winds the week before, but as I got closer, I realized what I was looking at didn't make any sense. About 12 feet up between two massive Douglas firs, there was this intricate structure of branches and small logs woven together. This wasn't just random debris caught in the trees. The branches were deliberately interwoven, creating this sort of platform or nest-like structure. Here's what really got me. Some of these branches were fresh breaks, and a few were from trees I knew weren't anywhere near this spot. We're talking branches from big leaf maples that I knew were at least a quarter-mile away. Something or someone had gathered these materials and constructed this thing. But why so high up? And how? Even with a ladder, it would have been a challenge to build something that complex at that height. I took out my phone and started documenting everything. The structure was roughly 8 feet across and looked sturdy enough to hold significant weight. Some of the woven branches were as thick as my arm. As I was taking photos, I noticed something else that made my skin crawl. There was hair caught in some of the rough bark. Dark, coarse hair that was definitely not from any black bear or deer I'd ever encountered. I collected a few strands of the hair in an evidence bag. We carry them for documenting illegal dumping and poaching cases. That's when I noticed the smell. Anyone who works in forests knows their smells. Rotting vegetation, animal musk, the occasional skunk. This was different. It was this powerful, pungent odor that reminded me of wet dog mixed with something rotten. The weird thing was, it seemed to come and go with the wind, but I couldn't locate its source. I decided to set up a few trail cameras in the area. We used them to monitor wildlife patterns and catch illegal campers. I put 3 Bushnell cameras at different angles facing the structure, making sure they had clear sight lines. Looking back, I wish I'd put more. Over the next few days, things got increasingly strange. I'd come back to check the cameras and find clear signs that something large had moved through the area. There were broken branches high up. We're talking 8, 10 feet off the ground, snapped in ways that made no sense for normal wildlife activity. But the cameras only caught dark shapes moving quickly through the frame. Whatever it was fast and seemed to know where the cameras were. The most unnerving part started happening at dusk. It began on the second day after finding the structure. I was doing a final check before heading back to my truck when I heard it. Distinct knocking sounds, like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree trunk. Knock, 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 knock. Then another series of knocks would answer from a different direction, further away. This went on for about 20 minutes. I've heard pretty much every sound these forests can make, but this was deliberate. It had a pattern. What really got to me was how the local wildlife reacted. The moment these knocks started, every bird in the vicinity went completely silent. Even the insects seemed to quiet down. It was like everything in the forest was holding its breath. On the 4th night, around 7:30 p.m., I captured something on one of the cameras that still haunts me. The camera picked up this sound. I can only describe it as a scream, but not like any animal I've ever heard. It started low, almost like a growl, then rose to this pitch that made my blood run cold when I reviewed the footage. It lasted for about 15 seconds, and right after, you can hear every bird in the area taking flight at once. The next morning, I found one of the cameras had been ripped off the tree. Not knocked off, ripped off. The mounting bracket was still screwed to the tree, but the camera itself had been torn away with such force that it broke the heavy-duty plastic casing. I found it about 30 feet away, smashed to pieces. The remaining cameras showed something large moving through the frame at around 3 a.m., but it was just a dark shape. Whatever it was, it had to be at least 7 feet tall, based on the reference markers I'd placed in the camera views. The movement wasn't like a bear or any other wildlife I'm familiar with. It was fluid, almost human-like, but too big to be a person. What really shakes me is what happened on the 5th day. I arrived early, around 6 a.m., just as the sky was starting to lighten. The structure between the trees was gone, not fallen down, gone. Every branch, every piece had been removed. But here's the thing. There was no debris on the ground. Whatever had built it had also dismantled it and carried everything away. I found fresh prints in the soft soil nearby. They were similar to human footprints but massive, easily 16 inches long. The stride length between prints was over 6 feet. I took photos and measurements, but by the time I could get another ranger out there to verify, a light rain had washed away most of the detail. The knocking sounds continued for a few more nights, always around dusk, always with that same call and response pattern. Then, just as suddenly as it all began, everything stopped. The forest returned to its normal sounds and patterns. The weird smell disappeared. It was like whatever had been there just moved on. I submitted a full report to my supervisors, complete with photos, the hair samples, and the audio recordings from the cameras. The official response was that it was probably bear activity combined with storm damage. But I've worked these forests for 15 years. I know bear signs. This was something else. The hair samples were sent to a lab, but the results came back inconclusive. Unidentified primate was the closest they could come to categorizing it. The audio recordings were analyzed too, but no one could match the scream to any known wildlife species in the region. I still check that spot every few days. Sometimes I find broken branches high up in the trees or unusual patterns of disturbed vegetation, but nothing like what I witnessed that week. I've been through every logical explanation I can think of, but none of them quite fit what I experienced. The weird thing is, other rangers in the area have started reporting similar structures in their patrol zones, always high up in the trees, always intricately woven. They appear for a few days, then vanish without a trace. No one's managed to get clear photos or video of what's building them. I've kept the audio recordings from those nights, and sometimes I listen to them again, just to remind myself that it really happened. That scream. It's like nothing I've ever heard before or since. Something intelligent was out there in those woods. Something that could plan, build, and communicate. Something that knew exactly where our cameras were and how to avoid them. I still work the same area, but I don't stay out as late anymore. And when I hear knocking sounds in the forest, even if they're just woodpeckers, I find myself listening a little more carefully, wondering if they're going to get an answer from somewhere deep in the woods. Story 11. There were 4 of us, me, Steve, Mike and Dave, all experienced riders who'd been doing annual mountain trips together for years. We'd chosen the Deer Lodge area because Dave had family there and knew some remote spots perfect for primitive camping. The spot we picked was about 15 miles outside of town, deep in the mountains where logging roads turned to dirt tracks. We rode out there on July 15th, late afternoon. The weather was perfect. Clear skies around 75 degrees with a light breeze. Found a decent clearing about half a mile off the main forest road, surrounded by dense pine forest. The kind of spot where you can really feel how far you are from civilization. We had our usual setup. 4 tents arranged in a rough square with our bikes parked nearby. Nothing fancy, just basic camping gear and enough food and beer for a couple of days. Everything was normal until about 9:30 p.m. We were sitting around the campfire having a few beers when all the night sounds just stopped. You know how the woods are usually full of noise, crickets, owls, all that? Complete silence. Even the crackling of our fire seemed too loud suddenly. Mike noticed it first, and when he mentioned it, we all felt it. That heavy silence that makes the hair on your neck stand up. Then came the smell. Jesus, that smell. I've been around plenty of dead animals in the woods, but this was different. Like rotting meat mixed with wet dog and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Dave actually gagged and had to pull his shirt over his nose. The weird thing was how it came and went, like whatever was causing it was moving around us. Around 10:15 p.m., we heard the first scream. I've heard mountain lions before, and this wasn't that. It started like a deep roar, but turned into this high-pitched howl that seemed to go on forever. The sound echoed off the mountains, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. Before it even finished, another one started from a different direction. Then another, and another. It was like we were surrounded. Steve wanted to pack up right then, but it was pitch black, and none of us felt good about trying to navigate those mountain roads at night. We decided to wait it out, but nobody was sleeping. We kept the fire going and stayed close together. The screams continued off and on for hours, sometimes seeming really close, other times farther away. Always from different directions, like whatever was making them was circling us. Around 2 a.m. something heavy started moving in the woods. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, breaking branches that sounded like gunshots in the quiet. We could hear trees creaking, like something massive was pushing past them. The smell got overwhelming again, and we could hear deep, rumbling breaths that didn't sound like any animal I know. None of us wanted to shine our flashlights into the woods. It was like some primal instinct telling us not to look, not to draw attention. But when we heard something metallic scraping across the ground, we had to. My heart nearly stopped when I saw my Harley being pushed over like it was a bicycle. These are 700-pound machines, and it went down like nothing. One by one, all our bikes were knocked over. We could hear the movement, see branches swaying in our flashlight beams, but whatever was doing it stayed just outside the light. The worst part? We kept seeing these massive shadows moving between the trees. Not just one, at least 3 different shapes, all huge, all moving with this weird fluid motion that wasn't quite human, but definitely wasn't like any animal I've ever seen. They were tall, way taller than any person. When they moved past the gaps in the trees where the moonlight came through, I could make out what looked like massive shoulders, long arms. Around 4 a.m., everything suddenly went quiet again. The smell lingered, but the movement stopped. We sat there, frozen, until the sun started coming up around 5:30. What we found in the morning still gives me nightmares. All our bikes had been tipped over, but not just knocked down. They'd been carefully laid on their sides, like something had deliberately placed them that way. There wasn't a scratch on them. The ground around our campsite was covered in tracks I still can't explain. They looked almost human, but massive, easily 18 inches long and 8 inches wide. They were pressed deep into the hard ground, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. The tracks formed an almost perfect circle around our campsite, about 30 feet out from our tents. Like whatever made them had been methodically walking around us all night. We found broken branches on trees 8, 9 feet up, snapped like twigs. Some of the tree trunks had these weird marks on them, like something had scraped its fingers or claws down them. We packed up as fast as we could and got out of there. The bike started fine, thankfully. On the ride back, we all kept checking our mirrors, feeling like we were being watched until we hit the main road. When we got to town, we stopped at a diner, and while we were trying to process what happened, this old local overheard us talking. He wasn't surprised at all. Said the area had a history of similar incidents going back decades. Told us we were lucky. Some people who've camped in those mountains never came back. I've gone over that night 1,000 times in my head. Tried to rationalize it, find some logical explanation. But I know what we experienced wasn't bears or mountain lions or any other normal wildlife. The coordinated movement, the deliberate actions with our bikes, the way they surrounded us but never attacked. It was almost like they were studying us, or maybe warning us. The 4 of us barely talk about it now. When we do, we still can't agree on exactly what we saw. But we all know one thing. Whatever was out there that night wasn't supposed to exist. I haven't been camping since then. Sold my bike 2 months later. Some nights I still wake up hearing those screams, smelling that awful smell. I know how this sounds, but I swear on everything I hold dear that every word I've written is true. I just hope I never experience anything like it again. The tracks we found were documented by local rangers, but they dismissed them as unusual bear activity. But I've seen bear tracks, and these weren't even close. They took plaster casts and measurements, but as far as I know, nothing ever came of it. Sometimes I wonder if they know more than they're saying. One detail that still haunts me. When we were packing up that morning, we found these weird arrangements of sticks and branches around our campsite, placed in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be random. The rangers didn't seem interested in those at all, which struck me as odd. I'm sharing this now because I recently heard about similar experiences in that same area. If you're planning to camp in the mountains around Deer Lodge, especially off Forest Route 173, think twice. Or at least don't go in small groups. Whatever's out there, it's intelligent, it's organized, and it's not alone. Story 12. We live about 4 miles outside of Hancock proper, in a pretty secluded area backed up against state forest land. Our nearest neighbor is about a quarter-mile down the road. We've got about 6 acres, mostly wooded, with a long driveway leading up to our house. That night, the forecast called for heavy snow. Nothing unusual for the UP in February. Around 8:30 p.m., the storm was really picking up. Sarah and I were in the living room. Our power was still on, surprisingly, and we were watching the weather reports. The wind was brutal, howling through the trees, and the snow was coming down so hard you could barely see our barn from the house, maybe 50 yards away. That's when our dog, Max, a 90-pound German shepherd, started acting weird. He'd been sleeping by the fireplace, but suddenly shot up and started growling at the window. Not his usual "there's a deer" bark. This was different, lower, more guttural. The hair on his back was standing straight up. I got up to check what he was looking at, thinking maybe a coyote had wandered onto our property looking for shelter from the storm. That's when we heard it. This deep, resonating sound that seemed to cut right through the howling wind. It wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a grunt. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard in these woods, and I've heard pretty much everything from bears to moose. Sarah joined me at the window, and Max backed away, still growling, but now pressing himself against our legs. That's when we saw it. Our driveway has those motion sensor lights, and one of them had clicked on. Through the swirling snow, we saw this figure. At first, my brain tried to make it a person, but people aren't that big. This thing was massive. I'm 6'2", and it would have towered over me. We have an 8-foot basketball hoop by the barn for when the grandkids visit, and this thing was definitely taller than that. It was moving across our property, from the tree line toward our driveway. The motion light gave us a clear enough view despite the snow. The thing that strikes me most, even now, was how it moved. Not like a person in a suit, not like a bear on its hind legs. It moved with this powerful, fluid grace that seemed impossible for something that size. Its fur was dark, maybe dark brown or black, hard to tell in the lighting and snow. But what really got me was that it was carrying something big and dark, cradled in its arms like it weighed nothing. It looked about the size of a deer, but I couldn't make out exactly what it was. Sarah grabbed my arm so hard it left marks. Neither of us spoke. We just watched as this thing crossed our property in maybe 6 or 7 strides. The distance it covered with each step was incredible. Later, when I measured the tracks, each stride was over 6 feet apart. Think about that. Not the length of the footprint, but the distance between steps. Max, our brave guard dog who once fought off a black bear that got too close to our garage, was whimpering now. He'd moved behind us, as far from the window as he could get while still keeping an eye on whatever was out there. Then we started hearing it. All the dogs in the area going crazy. The Petersons' 3 hunting dogs, the Wilsons' German shepherds, even old Mrs. Johnson's yappy little terriers, all barking and howling like crazy. But here's the weird thing. Our neighbors later told us none of their dogs would go outside. These are farm dogs, hunting dogs, dogs that live for the outdoors, and they were all refusing to set foot outside their doors. The creature disappeared into the trees on the other side of our property. The motion lights clicked off, and we were left staring into the swirling snow. But we could still hear it moving through the woods, the crack of branches, not from the wind, but from something big moving through them. Sarah and I stayed up most of the night. Max wouldn't leave our side, and he kept staring at the windows, growling softly. The local dogs kept up their barking for hours. The next morning, I went out to check for tracks as soon as it was light enough. The snow had kept falling until about 4 a.m., so I wasn't expecting to find much. But there they were. The snow was deep, about 18 inches of fresh powder, but the tracks were still clear as day. They were huge, easily 17 inches long and 8 inches wide. The stride length was incredible. I measured over 6 feet between some steps. And the depth of the impressions. Whatever made these tracks was heavy. I took photos, of course, but they don't do justice to what we saw. The tracks led from the state forest line, across our property, and back into the woods on the other side. There was also a weird drag mark in the snow alongside some of the tracks, probably from whatever it was carrying. I called the local police, more out of a sense of duty than anything else. They sent someone out, took some photos, made a report. The officer was professional, but I could tell he was skeptical. Can't blame him, really, if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. We found other things over the next few days as the snow melted. Broken branches high up in the trees. I'm talking 8, 9 feet off the ground. Some fur caught on a barbed wire fence at the edge of our property. Coarse, dark hair that didn't match any local wildlife. I still have it somewhere, but I've never gotten it tested. Part of me doesn't want to know. The weirdest thing, we never found any sign of what it was carrying. No blood in the snow, no remains, nothing. Just those drag marks in the snow alongside its tracks. The dogs in the area were skittish for weeks afterward. Max wouldn't go out at night for almost a month unless one of us went with him. He's still weird about that side of the property. Won't go near the tree line where we first saw it emerge. Since that night we've heard strange sounds in the woods a few times, that same deep resonating call, but we've never seen it again. Sarah installed more security lights around the property, and we got cameras up within a week of the incident. Haven't caught anything unusual on them, though. I've lived in the UP my whole life. I'm a rational person. I work in engineering. I believe in facts and evidence. But I know what we saw that night. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a suit. It was something else. Something that, by any reasonable standard, shouldn't exist in the forests of Michigan. I still go hunting, still spend time in the woods. But something changed after that night. The forest feels different now. Like I'm not quite at the top of the food chain anymore. Like something's watching, something big. People ask me sometimes if I'm sure about what I saw, if maybe the storm and the darkness played tricks on us. All I can say is this: when you see something that your brain tells you can't possibly exist, something that completely shatters your understanding of what's real and what isn't, you don't forget it. You don't misremember it. It burns itself into your memory in a way that normal experiences just don't. That thing was real. It was there, on our property, in the middle of a snowstorm. And sometimes, on winter nights when the wind is howling and the snow is falling thick, I find myself looking out the window, wondering if it's still out there in the darkness, watching and waiting. Story 13. It was March 15th, 2021. The weather had just started warming up in Virginia, and our team of 4 had gotten permission to explore some unmapped cave systems near Elkton. I've been mapping caves in the Shenandoah Valley for years, but this particular system had somehow stayed off our radar. The entrance was hidden behind thick vegetation on private property, about 12 miles from the nearest paved road. The team consisted of myself, Mike, our geological expert, Sarah, our photography specialist, and Tom, our safety officer. We'd worked together for 5 years and had a solid reputation in the Virginia caving community. We arrived at the site around 7 a.m., planning to do an initial survey of the cave system. The first weird thing we noticed were the tracks leading to the cave entrance. I've seen bear tracks, mountain lion tracks, and every other kind of local wildlife print, but these were different. They were human-like but massive, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. The stride length between prints was incredible, nearly 6 feet apart. Mike took measurements and photographs, though he kept saying they had to be some kind of hoax or erosion pattern. The smell hit us before we even entered the cave. This overwhelming, musky odor that made my eyes water. It wasn't the usual cave dampness or bat guano smell. This was different, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation and something else I couldn't place. Sarah actually gagged and had to step away for a moment. We switched on our headlamps and began our descent. The entrance was surprisingly large, about 8 feet high and 12 feet wide. The limestone walls showed signs of natural formation, but something felt off. There were scratch marks on the walls, but not like normal bear scratches. These were higher up, some nearly 9 feet from the floor, and they had a distinctly different pattern, 5 parallel lines, deeply gouged into the rock. About 200 feet in, the main tunnel opened into a larger chamber. Our lights revealed something that made my blood run cold. The chamber floor was covered with what looked like deliberately constructed nests, huge circles of woven branches, leaves and grass, some 8 feet in diameter. Mixed in with the vegetation were bones, lots of them. Deer bones, what looked like wild boar remains, and other smaller animals. The bones weren't scattered randomly. They were piled neatly at the edges of the nests. The air got thicker the deeper we went. The musky smell was so strong it felt like it was coating the inside of my nose and throat. Our lights caught movement in the shadows several times, but it was probably just bats. Probably. Then we heard it. A deep rumbling sound that seemed to come from deeper within the cave system. It wasn't the sound of falling rocks or water. I know all those cave noises. This was organic, almost like a growl, but deeper than any animal I've ever heard. Sarah's hand grabbed my arm so tight it left bruises. We pressed on for another 100 feet or so, documenting everything with our cameras. The scratch marks on the walls became more frequent, and we started finding patches of coarse, dark hair caught on rock formations. Mike collected some samples, though his hands were shaking so bad he dropped the collection bag twice. That's when Tom's headlamp caught something that made us all freeze. In a patch of soft clay near the tunnel wall, there was a fresh print, the same kind we'd seen outside, but this one was perfect, undisturbed. It was so fresh the edges hadn't even dried. Something had made that print recently, very recently. The deep rumble came again, closer this time, followed by what I can only describe as wood knocking against stone. 3 distinct knocks that echoed through the tunnel. Then the air pressure changed. You know that feeling when a train is coming through a tunnel? It was like that, but we were hundreds of feet underground where no train could possibly be. We heard movement ahead of us, the sound of something large shifting its weight on the rocky floor. Our lights caught a glimpse of something moving in the darkness ahead. Something big. Really big. The figure was mostly obscured by a rock formation, but what I did see will haunt me forever. A massive shoulder, covered in dark brown hair, disappearing behind the rocks. It had to have been at least 8 feet tall to match the height I saw from the shoulder position. That's when the screaming started. Not from any of us. This came from deeper in the cave. It was unlike anything I've ever heard. Not quite human, not quite animal. It reverberated through the entire cave system, making small rocks fall from the ceiling. The sound paralyzed us for a moment, and I felt this overwhelming sense of primal fear wash over me. Every instinct was screaming at me to run. Sarah's camera dropped to the ground. The sound of it hitting the rock seemed to snap us out of our paralysis. Tom was the first to turn, practically pushing us back the way we came. We ran. I've never run so fast in my life, especially not in a cave. Basic caving safety protocols went out the window. We just needed to get out. The whole time we were running, we could hear movement behind us. Rocks shifting, that deep rumbling sound, and what sounded like heavy footfalls. The smell got stronger, like whatever it was right behind us. None of us dared to look back. We burst out of the cave entrance into the daylight. We didn't stop running until we reached our vehicles. Mike was hyperventilating, Sarah was crying, and Tom was as white as a sheet. All of our expensive cave surveying equipment was still inside, but there was no way we were going back for it. When we finally calmed down enough to talk, we tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Bears don't make nests like that. They don't stack bones neatly. They don't leave prints that look almost human. And they definitely don't stand 8 feet tall. We reported the incident to the local authorities, but they just filed it as a standard cave survey report. They suggested maybe we'd seen a bear and our minds had played tricks on us in the dark. But they couldn't explain the nests, the prints, or the hair samples Mike had managed to hold on to during our escape. We sent the hair samples to a lab for analysis. The results came back inconclusive, not matching any known local wildlife. The lab suggested contamination or mixed samples, but Mike swears he collected them properly. I've been back to Elkton several times since then, but I haven't gone near that cave system again. Sometimes at night I still hear that scream in my dreams. The locals have started telling stories about strange noises coming from that area of the woods, and some farmers have reported missing livestock. Our team hasn't gone caving together since that day. Sarah moved to Colorado, Tom quit spelunking altogether, and Mike became obsessed with researching similar incidents in the area. He's found records of strange sightings going back to the 1800s around Elkton, but nothing as detailed as what we experienced. I know how this all sounds. Trust me, I've spent countless nights trying to come up with rational explanations for what we encountered. But the prints, the nests, the hair, that smell, and most of all that massive shape in the darkness, it was all real. Something lives in those caves, something that shouldn't exist according to any zoology textbook. The equipment we left behind, it's still there as far as I know. Nobody's been willing to go back in to retrieve it. The cave entrance has since been marked as dangerous and sealed off by the property owner. Sometimes I wonder if that's for the best. Some things in this world aren't meant to be found, and some caves are better left unexplored. Story 14. I never thought I'd be sharing this story, but what happened to my family in Greenbrier State Forest last summer still keeps me up at night. My wife Sarah and I took our daughter Emma, who was 4 at the time, for what was supposed to be a peaceful Saturday morning hike on August 23, 2019. We'd done this trail dozens of times before. It's a relatively easy 3-mile loop that starts at the Montgomery Creek parking area. The weather was perfect that morning, around 75 degrees with a light breeze, and we set out around 9:30 a.m. Everything seemed normal for the first mile or so. Emma was in a great mood, pointing out butterflies and collecting interesting leaves like she always did. We even saw a few deer in the distance, which usually made her day. The trail wasn't busy. We'd only passed one other group heading back to the parking lot about 20 minutes in. It was when we reached the part where the trail curves around the old granite outcropping that things started feeling different. I noticed it first. The birds had gone completely silent. If you spend any time hiking, you know how unnatural that feels. The woods are never truly quiet. I remember checking my watch. It was 10:17 a.m. I'll never forget that time. As we rounded the bend, I stopped dead in my tracks. About 30 feet ahead of us, something was obviously wrong with the trees. These weren't big trees, mostly younger growth, maybe 3-4 inches in diameter, but they were bent, not broken, bent. At least 8 or 9 of them were twisted and woven together in this weird pattern, making what looked like a deliberate barrier about 7 feet high. I've been hiking these woods for over a decade, and I've never seen anything like it. No storm could do that. This was intentional. I'm a construction supervisor. I know what storm damage looks like. This was different. The trees were literally braided together, with smaller branches woven through them. Some were bent over at perfect 90-degree angles, which just doesn't happen naturally. The bark wasn't splintered or cracked like it would be if they'd been damaged by wind or snow. They were just bent, like they'd been manipulated while they were growing. I was taking pictures with my phone when Emma tugged on my jacket sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, "the big monkey is watching us." My blood ran cold. Emma had never seen a gorilla outside of pictures in the zoo. She'd never even heard of Bigfoot. We'd made sure to avoid those kinds of stories because she was easily scared. But when I turned to look where she was pointing, about 50 yards up the slope to our right, I saw it. I've spent 20 years in these woods. I know what bears look like, even standing up. This wasn't a bear. It was massive. I'd estimate at least 8 feet tall and covered in dark, matted hair. But what hit me hardest was how it was positioning itself. It was partially behind a large oak tree, but leaning out just enough to watch us. The intelligence in that movement. It wasn't an animal hiding. It was something deliberately concealing itself while observing us. The smell hit me then. This horrible, pungent odor like wet dog mixed with rotting meat and something else I can't even describe. Sarah smelled it too. I saw her cover her nose. Emma was still pointing, completely calm in that way only small children can be when faced with something that should be terrifying. I raised my phone to take a picture, trying to steady my shaking hands. The moment I did, the creature moved. But saying it moved doesn't do justice to what I saw. 1 second it was there, and in literally the next second, it had covered about 30 feet of ground, disappearing behind another cluster of trees. Something that big should not be able to move that fast. It wasn't like watching a person or an animal run. It was more like watching a shadow slide across the ground. The sound it made as it moved, that's what haunts me the most. Not heavy footsteps like you'd expect from something that size. Instead, there was this low frequency. I don't know how else to describe it except as a rumble that I felt more than heard. It made the hair on my arms stand up, and I could feel it in my chest. We didn't stick around. I picked up Emma, and we got out of there as fast as we could without running. The whole way back, that feeling of being watched never left. We could hear movement in the woods parallel to the trail, branches snapping, that weird rumbling sound continuing intermittently. Whatever it was, it followed us for at least half a mile before the sounds faded. When we got back to the car, I checked my phone. The pictures of the bent trees came out clear as day, I still have them. But when I tried to show Sarah the photo I'd tried to take of the creature, there was nothing but a dark blur against the trees. Classic, right? But I know what we saw. We drove straight to the ranger station and reported what happened. The ranger on duty, Dave, took our report seriously, but you could tell he was skeptical. He said they'd check it out. When I went back the next day with 2 friends to show them the bent trees, they were still there. But 3 days later, when I convinced a local news reporter to come look, the trees had been broken down. Not unbent, broken. The stumps were still there, and you could see how they'd been snapped off about 2 feet above the ground. Emma still talks about the big monkey sometimes, completely matter of fact, like it's the most normal thing in the world. She's 5 now, and her child psychologist says she's perfectly well adjusted. No trauma, no nightmares. Sometimes I envy her acceptance of what we saw. I've tried to rationalize it. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head. But I know what I saw that day wasn't human, wasn't a bear, wasn't any known animal. The calculated intelligence of its movements, the impossible speed, the way it manipulated those trees. Sometimes late at night, I'll catch that same putrid smell on the wind, even though we've moved to a different part of town. Sarah says it's my imagination. Maybe she's right. But here's what keeps me up at night. Emma was the first one to spot it. It was watching us long before I noticed it. And sometimes I wonder, was that the first time it had watched us on that trail? Or had it been there other times observing us, and we just hadn't noticed? We still go hiking, but never on that trail, and never in Greenbrier. Some doors once opened can't be closed. Some things once seen can't be unseen. I don't know what we encountered that day, but I know it was real, and I know it was intelligent. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the backyard at dusk, I still get that feeling of being watched. Story 15. It was July 14th, 2022. I was conducting field research in the foothills about 12 miles northeast of Red Lodge, focusing on sedimentary deposits from the late Pleistocene era. The weather was perfect that morning, clear skies, around 65 degrees Fahrenheit, with just a light breeze. I'd been in the area for 3 days already, camping out of my truck and collecting samples. Around 2 p.m., I was examining an exposed rock face when I noticed something odd in the sedimentary layers. At first, I thought they were just typical trace fossils, but as I cleared away more dirt, my heart nearly stopped. There, perfectly preserved in the rock, was what looked like a line of footprints. But these weren't your typical prehistoric animal tracks. They were humanoid, but massive. Each impression was roughly 16 inches long and 7 inches wide at the ball of the foot. The stride length between prints was consistently around 4.5 feet. I've studied human evolution and am familiar with known hominid fossils. These prints didn't match anything I'd ever seen in the literature. The depth of the impression suggested whatever made them was incredibly heavy. I spent hours documenting everything, taking photos, measurements, and GPS coordinates. I even made several plaster casts, though my hands were shaking the whole time. As the sun started setting, I headed back to my campsite, about 2 miles from the fossil site. I had a simple setup. Just my 2-person tent, sleeping bag, and basic camping gear. My truck was parked about 50 feet from the tent. I always keep my field equipment organized, so I had my audio recorder running to document field notes, my LED lantern, and my satellite phone nearby. Cell service was non-existent out there. I had just finished heating up some freeze-dried stroganoff on my camp stove when the woods went dead silent. Anyone who spends time outdoors knows that sudden silence means something's wrong. The constant background noise of birds, insects, and small animals just stopped. It was around 9:15 p.m., and though it was getting dark, there was still some light from the quarter moon. That's when I first noticed the smell. It hit me like a wall, this overwhelming musky odor, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation, and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I've encountered bears before, but this smell was completely different. I heard the first footstep at 9:27 p.m. I know because my audio recorder caught it. It was a heavy thud that actually made my coffee cup vibrate. Then another, and another. Whatever it was circling my campsite, staying just at the edge of where my lantern light faded into darkness. I grabbed my satellite phone and bear spray and retreated to my tent. I know it sounds stupid to hide in a thin nylon shelter, but I felt exposed out in the open. The footsteps continued circling, sometimes coming closer, sometimes moving further away. My audio recorder picked up deep, rhythmic breathing, not like a bear's huffing, but more like a massive human taking slow, deliberate breaths. Then it started making sounds I still can't explain. The closest I can describe is a combination of deep whoops and what sounded almost like wood knocking against wood. But there was also this low-frequency rumble that I could feel in my chest more than hear. It was so loud that I'm sure it could have been heard for miles. The worst part was around 11 p.m. I was lying absolutely still in my tent when something large moved directly beside it. The breathing was so close I could feel the tent wall move with each exhale. The smell was overwhelming. Whatever it was huge. I could see its shadow against the tent wall, and it had to be at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a massive head. I've never felt terror like that before. I'm a scientist, trained to observe and analyze, but in that moment, I was completely paralyzed with fear. My heart was pounding so hard, I was worried the creature could hear it. It stayed there, right next to my tent, for what felt like hours, but was probably about 20 minutes according to my recorder. Then, without warning, it started moving away. The footsteps grew more distant, and gradually, the normal nighttime sounds of the forest returned. By 2 a.m., everything seemed normal again, but I didn't sleep a single minute that night. When dawn finally came, I practically ran out to check the area around my camp. The ground was mostly rocky, but in a few patches of softer earth I found footprints. They were the same shape as the fossils I'd discovered, but fresh. Each print was about 16 inches long, just like the fossils. I took photos and measurements, my hands still shaking. What really gets me is how similar these prints were to the fossilized ones I'd found earlier that day. Same approximate size, same distinctive arch pattern. The implications of this are, well, I'm still trying to process them. I packed up my camp in record time and got out of there. I have all the documentation, photos of both the fossils and the fresh prints, audio recordings of the entire night, measurements and plaster casts. But I've been hesitant to share them professionally. My reputation in the geological community is important to me, and this kind of thing, it's not something you can just bring up at academic conferences. The most frustrating part is that the audio recordings, while clear in capturing the footsteps and breathing, don't fully convey the sheer terror of that night. The feeling of being stalked by something that shouldn't exist. Something that left evidence of its presence both in modern soil and in ancient rock. It challenges everything I thought I knew about natural history. I've gone back to Red Lodge since then, but only during daylight hours and never alone. I've tried to find those fossilized prints again, but recent landslides have altered the area significantly. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I listen to those audio recordings or look at the photos, and I know it was real. I'm not claiming to know what was out there that night. As a scientist, I deal in evidence and facts. What I can say with certainty is that something huge walked around my camp for hours, something that left footprints matching 15,000-year-old fossils I discovered that same day. Make of that what you will. I still do field work, but never alone anymore, and I always leave the area well before dark. Some things you only need to experience once to learn your lesson. I don't know what's out there in the wilderness around Red Lodge, but I know I never want to be that close to it again. Story 16. My wife and I moved to a pretty secluded spot about 15 minutes outside of Marlington back in 2019. We've got about 3 acres, mostly wooded, backing up against the Monongahela National Forest. It's the kind of place where your closest neighbor is a quarter-mile away, and the only sounds at night are usually just crickets and the occasional owl. Everything was perfectly normal until March 2020. That's when the trouble with our garbage bins started. At first, we thought it was just bears. We get them around here sometimes, especially in spring when they're hungry after winter. But this was different. Every single morning, we'd find our heavy-duty garbage bins completely overturned, garbage scattered everywhere. These weren't your typical plastic bins. We had invested in bear-proof containers with heavy metal clasps specifically because we lived in bear country. The weird part, the clasps weren't broken or damaged. Whatever was getting into them was smart enough to actually unlatch them. We'd find the metal clasps perfectly intact, just opened. As someone who has dealt with bears before, I knew this wasn't typical bear behavior. Bears usually just destroy the containers. After about a week of this, I decided to install some trail cameras. I already had a couple from when I used to do some hunting, but I bought 2 more high-end ones with night vision capabilities. I set them up at different angles around our garbage area, making sure to cover all approaches. I remember feeling pretty confident that we'd catch whatever animal was causing this mess. The first few nights, nothing happened. It was like whatever it was knew we were watching. But on the 4th night, around 2:30 a.m., we got our first glimpse of something. I still get goosebumps thinking about what I saw in that footage. The first thing that struck me was the height. Using the fence post nearby as reference, which I know is exactly 6 feet tall, this thing had to be at least 8 feet tall. It moved into frame with an eerily smooth gait, walking completely upright on 2 legs. The fur was dark, almost black, but had this slight reddish tint where the infrared light hit it. But what really got to me was how it handled the garbage bins. There was no clumsy fumbling or brute force. It carefully, and I mean carefully, unlatched each clasp with what looked like purposeful finger movements. The creature's hands. They weren't paws. They were more like large, human-like hands, but covered in fur. The way it moved was so deliberate. It would approach the bins while keeping its head turned slightly away from the cameras, like it understood what they were. In all the footage we got, we never got a clear shot of its face. It always positioned itself at an angle or turned away at just the right moment. One night, I made the mistake of trying to catch it in the act. I'd started having trouble sleeping anyway, constantly listening for sounds outside. Around 2 a.m., I heard the distinctive sound of something moving around near our bins. The motion-activated floodlight hadn't gone on yet, which was strange because it usually picked up even small animals. I grabbed my flashlight and my shotgun, standard procedure out here when investigating noises at night, and quietly made my way to our back door. The moment I opened it, I was hit with this overwhelming smell, like wet dog mixed with something rotting and musky. It was so strong it made my eyes water. That's when I heard it. Not the sound of the bins this time, but a deep rumbling sound that I felt more than heard. It was like a growl, but deeper than any bear I've ever encountered. Every hair on my body stood up, and I was frozen in place. The motion light finally kicked on, and there it was, about 30 feet from our back door. Even though it was partially behind our large oak tree, I could see its massive shoulder and part of its side. The fur was thick and matted, moving slightly in the breeze. What gets me is how it didn't immediately run when the light came on. It slowly, deliberately moved behind the tree, but I could still see part of it. Then it made that sound again, and I swear it was directing it at me. I'd love to say I was brave enough to stand my ground, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get back inside. I backed up slowly, never taking my eyes off the tree, and closed the door as quietly as I could. I heard heavy footsteps moving away through the woods, branches cracking under its weight. The next morning, I found something that still haunts me. Besides the usual mess from the garbage, there were footprints in the soft ground near the bins. They were huge, easily 16 inches long, and showed clear toe impressions. What really got to me was their depth. Whatever made them had to be incredibly heavy to sink that deep into the packed earth. I took photos and measurements of everything, though my hands were shaking so bad I had to retake most of the pictures. I even made plaster casts of the prints, which I still have locked away in our garage. I'm not sure why I keep them. Maybe as proof to myself that I'm not crazy. The strangest part of all this? It just stopped. About 2 weeks after my face-to-face encounter, the nightly visits ceased completely. No more open bins, no more footprints, no more of that terrible smell. It was like whatever it was just moved on, though sometimes on really quiet nights I swear I can hear that deep rumble coming from the forest. We still live in the same house, but we've made some changes. The garbage bins are now kept in our garage until collection day. I've installed more security lights, though I notice they sometimes malfunction for no apparent reason. We've also had a few other weird incidents. Tools moved in the garage, strange noises at night, but nothing as dramatic as those 2 weeks in March 2020. I've tried talking to some locals about it, but most just shrug it off as bears, even when I show them the footage. A few older residents, though, they get this look in their eyes when I mention it. They don't say much, but they don't dismiss it either. One elderly man at the hardware store just nodded and said, "These mountains are old. They keep their secrets." I'm not claiming to know what it was. I've probably watched that footage hundreds of times now, trying to convince myself it was just a bear walking funny or someone in a costume, though who would trek through dense forest at 2 a.m. just to go through my garbage? But I know what I saw. Those movements were too fluid, too deliberate. The intelligence in its actions was undeniable. The thing that really keeps me up at night isn't the creature itself, but the feeling that it was studying us just as much as we were trying to study it. Those carefully angled movements to avoid the cameras, the way it seemed to watch the house. It wasn't just some animal looking for food. It knew exactly what it was doing. I still check the cameras every morning, and I've started keeping a journal of any unusual sounds or occurrences. Maybe it'll come back, maybe it won't. But one thing's for certain, these woods hold something that science can't explain, and I've got the footage to prove it. Story 17. What happened to us during our camping trip in Forks still keeps me up some nights, and I'm hoping that writing about it might help me process it better. I've always been a rational person. I work in software development, I believe in science, and I generally think there's a logical explanation for most things. But what happened that weekend in September 2021 has completely shaken my worldview. It was supposed to be a regular camping trip with my best friend Mike and his girlfriend Sarah. We'd been planning it for weeks, wanting to catch the last bit of decent weather before the infamous Washington rain kicked in. We chose the Olympic National Forest near Forks. Yeah, the same place from those vampire movies, which we actually joked about on the drive up. If only we'd known what was really lurking in those woods. We arrived at the Bogachil River area around 2 p.m. on a Friday. The weather was typical for September in the Pacific Northwest. Overcast but dry, with temperatures in the mid-60s. We picked a spot about 2 miles from the main trail, far enough to feel secluded, but not so remote that we couldn't hike back quickly if needed. The area was beautiful. Old-growth forest with massive Douglas firs and western red cedars, thick undergrowth, and that deep, earthy smell you only get in old forests. Setting up camp took longer than expected because Mike insisted on proper bear precautions, storing food in sealed containers and hanging them between trees. Sarah thought he was being paranoid, but I sided with him. Better safe than sorry in bear country. We had 2 tents, one for them and one for me, set up in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides, with a gentle slope leading down to a muddy creek bed about 50 yards away. The evening was normal enough. We grilled some burgers, had a few beers, and sat around the campfire sharing stories. But around 8:30 p.m., something felt off. The forest had gotten unusually quiet. At first, I didn't think much of it. Animals often go quiet when humans are around. But this was different. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the entire forest. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Mike noticed it too. I caught him scanning the tree line with his flashlight several times. Sarah asked him what he was looking for, but he just shrugged it off. Around 10 p.m. we decided to turn in. I remember checking my tent zippers twice, something I'd never done before. There was just this feeling, like we were being watched. I dozed off eventually, but woke up around 2 a.m. needing to pee. As I was about to unzip my tent, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a sound I'd never heard before and hoped to never hear again. A deep guttural breath like someone trying to smell something, but it was too loud to be human. It seemed to come from the direction of the creek. I froze, completely froze. I'm not ashamed to admit I was terrified. The breathing continued for what felt like minutes, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then I heard heavy footsteps, slow, deliberate steps that made tiny tremors I could feel through the ground. Whatever it was massive. I wanted to wake Mike and Sarah, but I was paralyzed with fear. The footsteps moved around our campsite, circling slowly. There was a smell too, like wet dog mixed with something rotten. At one point, the footsteps stopped right next to my tent. I could hear that breathing again, now directly above me. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it could hear it. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually the footsteps moved away, and the forest slowly began to come alive again with normal nighttime sounds. I must have fallen asleep from pure exhaustion, because the next thing I remember was Mike's voice outside my tent around 7 a.m. "Hey, you need to see this." His voice sounded strange, tense and uncertain. When I unzipped my tent, I found Mike and Sarah standing near the creek, staring at the ground. The morning fog was still heavy, giving everything a surreal quality. As I approached them, I saw what they were looking at, and my legs nearly gave out. There, in the soft mud near the creek, was an enormous impression, like something massive had laid down on its side. The ground was compressed in a roughly humanoid shape, but the size, it had to be at least 8 feet long. You could see where whatever it was had rested its head, its torso, its legs. The impression was deep, suggesting something incredibly heavy. But that wasn't the worst part. Leading up to this spot were footprints, massive, human-like footprints, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. They came from the forest, led to the impression in the mud, and then continued back into the dense undergrowth. The stride length between prints was enormous, at least 5 feet apart. We followed the tracks as far as we could, but they disappeared into a thicket of salal bushes and ferns. The vegetation was so dense there was no way to continue without proper tools. Besides, none of us was particularly eager to follow them further. Sarah took some photos with her phone, but they honestly don't do justice to what we saw. The scale is hard to capture in pictures, and the morning shadows made it difficult to see the details that were so clear in person. Looking at those photos now, they seem almost underwhelming compared to what we witnessed. The most unsettling realization came when we really thought about what we were looking at. Whatever made those prints had laid there, probably for hours, watching our campsite from the creek bed. From that position, it would have had a perfect view of our tents. The thought that this thing had been so close, observing us while we slept, still makes my skin crawl. We packed up immediately. Nobody said much as we hiked back to the car. What was there to say? We'd all seen the same thing, but none of us wanted to be the first to put it into words. It wasn't until we were in the car, heading back toward civilization, that Sarah finally said what we were all thinking. "That was a Bigfoot, wasn't it?" Mike and I just nodded. What else could it have been? Bears don't leave humanoid impressions or bipedal tracks. The size and shape were all wrong for any known animal. I've seen plenty of bear tracks in my years of camping. These were something else entirely. We reported it to the ranger station, but I could tell by their reaction that they weren't taking it seriously. They logged it as a possible bear sighting and said they'd look into it. We didn't push the issue. How could we? We had no real evidence besides some photos that didn't capture the true scale and detail of what we'd seen. I've gone back and forth countless times trying to rationalize what happened. Could it have been an elaborate prank? Seems unlikely given how remote we were and the sheer effort it would take. A bear? The tracks and impression were clearly bipedal and humanoid. Some other animal? Nothing in North America matches what we saw. The thing that still haunts me isn't just what we saw. It's what we heard and felt that night. That breathing, those footsteps, that overwhelming sense of being watched. Sometimes when I'm camping now, always in designated campgrounds with plenty of other people around, I'll wake up at night and hear the forest go quiet, and my heart starts racing. I know how this story sounds. If someone had told me this 3 years ago, I probably wouldn't have believed them. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and what I felt. Something was watching us that night. Something huge and intelligent enough to stay hidden while observing us for hours. Something that left evidence of its presence but vanished without a trace into some of the densest forest in Washington state. I've read other encounters since then, trying to make sense of what happened. Many details match. The sudden silence in the forest, the feeling of being watched, the smell. But reading about it and experiencing it are two very different things. There's a visceral quality to the fear you feel when you realize you're not at the top of the food chain, when you know something large and unknown is watching you from the darkness. We still go camping occasionally, but never in that area and never far from other people. Sarah and Mike got married last year, and we sometimes talk about that night, usually after a few drinks. We've all separately looked into other Bigfoot sightings around Forks. Turns out there's quite a history there that we didn't know about before our trip. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm just sharing what happened to us. Make of it what you will. But if you're camping in the Olympic National Forest and the forest suddenly goes quiet, if you feel that prickle on the back of your neck that tells you you're being watched, if you catch that distinctive smell, my advice is to pack up and leave. Some questions are better left unanswered. One last thing, I've never felt right about those massive footprints just disappearing into the undergrowth. It's like whatever it was just vanished, despite its size. That's the part that really gets to me when I think about it. How can something that big move so quietly and disappear so completely? The Olympic National Forest is huge, with vast areas that humans rarely visit. Sometimes I wonder what else is out there, watching and waiting in those deep, dark woods. Story 18. I've worked as a park ranger at Mammoth Cave National Park for over 8 years. But what happened in the summer of 2019 still keeps me up at night sometimes. I'm finally sharing this because I need to get it off my chest. And maybe someone else has seen something similar. It started in early June when we began finding these weird structures deep in the woods. I'm not talking about typical camping shelters. These were massive lean-tos made from thick branches that would have taken incredible strength to manipulate. The largest one I found was almost 8 feet tall, with branches woven so tightly together it was nearly weatherproof. In my years of experience, I'd never seen anything like it. The structures were always in the most remote areas, far from the marked trails. At first we assumed it was vandals or maybe some survivalist types camping illegally, but something felt off. The branches used weren't cut. They were broken, twisted and stripped in ways that didn't make sense. Some of these branches were thick as my arm, and they were bent like pretzels. By mid-July, visitors started reporting weird experiences. A family told me they heard what sounded like wood knocking coming from deep in the forest, like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree. Others mentioned an awful smell, like a mix of wet dog and rotting meat. I caught that smell myself a few times while on patrol, and it was unlike anything I'd encountered before. So strong it would make your eyes water. The incident that really shook me happened on August 12th. I was doing a late patrol around 8:30 p.m., checking one of the more remote areas where we'd found several of these structures. The sun was setting, and there was still some light, but the forest was getting dark. I had my flashlight, but I tried not to use it much so my eyes could adjust to the darkness. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Usually there's a constant background noise in the forest. Birds, insects, small animals. But everything had gone completely quiet. The air felt heavy, like right before a storm, but the sky was clear. That's when I smelled it, that same putrid odor, stronger than ever. I've been around bears and other wildlife plenty of times, but something about this felt different. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I had this overwhelming feeling of being watched. I swept my flashlight around slowly, trying to stay calm and professional, when I heard branches breaking behind me. Not small twigs, but the sound of major limbs being snapped like toothpicks. When I turned around, I saw something that my brain still struggles to process. About 50 yards away, partially hidden by the trees, was a massive dark figure. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller, and it was built like a linebacker, but proportioned all wrong for a human. The shoulders were too wide, the arms too long. It was covered in dark hair, and even from that distance I could see muscles rippling as it moved. What really got me were the eyes. My flashlight beam caught them for just a second, and they reflected back with this reddish-orange glow, like a deer's eyes, but much larger, and set in a face that was somewhere between ape and human. The moment our eyes met, I felt this primal terror wash over me. This wasn't just a large animal. There was intelligence in those eyes. I'd love to say I stood my ground or tried to document it, but instinct took over. I started backing away slowly, keeping my light on it. The figure stayed perfectly still, just watching me. Then it made this sound, not quite a growl, not quite a grunt, but deep and resonant enough that I felt it in my chest. That's when I broke and ran. I'm trained for wildlife encounters, but nothing prepared me for this. I radioed for backup as I made my way back to the main trail, but by the time other rangers arrived, whatever it was had vanished. We found footprints, though, huge ones, about 16 inches long, pressed deep into the soil. The stride length was over 6 feet. No bear or known animal makes tracks like that. The next day, we found more evidence. There were fresh branch breaks about 8 feet up on several trees, and some of the bark had been stripped away by something with massive strength. We also found tufts of dark hair caught on some thorny bushes. The hair samples were sent for testing, but like most of these cases, the results came back inconclusive. The strange activity continued for a few more weeks, then suddenly stopped in mid-September. The structures remained, but the sounds, smells, and sightings ceased. We never got any clear photos, despite setting up several trail cameras. The only image we captured was a dark, blurry shape moving between trees at dusk, but it was enough to confirm what I saw wasn't just my imagination. I've spent countless hours trying to rationalize what happened that night. I've dealt with every kind of wildlife native to Kentucky, and this was something else entirely. The size, the way it moved, those eyes. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a person in a suit, wasn't any known animal. The official report lists it as an unidentified wildlife encounter, but those of us who were there know it was something more. Some of my colleagues think I'm crazy, and maybe I am, but I know what I saw, and I know those structures weren't made by any normal wildlife or human visitors. Whatever it was intelligent enough to avoid our cameras, strong enough to break thick branches like twigs, and smart enough to disappear completely when too many people started paying attention. I still work at Mammoth Cave, but I don't do solo patrols in those remote areas anymore, especially not at dusk. Sometimes when I'm in the park, I'll catch that distinctive smell or hear wood knocking in the distance, and my heart starts racing. I don't know if it's still out there, but I do know that there are things in these woods that science can't explain. I'm sharing this now because people deserve to know what's out there. I've read other accounts from this area that describe similar experiences, and they can't all be making it up. Something intelligent and unknown is living in these forests, and I've seen it with my own eyes. Story 19. It started on October 12, 2022. I own about 40 acres of hunting land just outside Woodville, Mississippi, mostly hardwood forest that's been in my family for generations. I've had a favorite hunting spot there for years, a sturdy platform stand I built myself, secured to a massive white oak about 15 feet up. Never had any issues with it until that day. I headed out early that morning to do some routine maintenance before the peak of deer season. The temperature was in the low 60s, typical fall morning in Mississippi. As I approached my stand through the familiar trail, something felt different. The woods were unusually quiet. No squirrels, no birds, nothing. Anyone who spends time in the woods knows that's not normal. When I got to my stand, my heart nearly stopped. The platform, my solid, overbuilt hunting stand that had weathered countless storms, was completely destroyed. Not just damaged, but literally ripped apart. The thick, treated lumber was splintered and torn like cardboard. The heavy-duty ratchet straps that helped secure it were shredded. But what really got to me were the claw marks. Deep gouges in the oak's bark that went all the way up to where the platform had been mounted, about 15 feet high. These weren't bear marks. We rarely get bears in this part of Mississippi, and I've seen bear damage before. These gouges were wider, deeper, and the pattern was all wrong. Some of the marks were nearly 2 inches deep into solid oak. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I circled the tree, examining the destruction. The ground around the tree was littered with splinters and hardware, but something else caught my eye. A partial footprint in a patch of soft earth near the base of the tree. It had rained the night before, making the ground perfect for tracking, but this wasn't any track I'd ever seen. It was huge, easily 16 inches long, with clear toe impressions. I've tracked everything from deer to wild hogs to black bears, but this was different. The depth of the impression suggested whatever made it was incredibly heavy. I took out my phone and started documenting everything. The destruction, the claw marks, the footprint. I photographed it all, My hands were shaking so bad some of the pictures came out blurry. While I was taking pictures, I started getting this overwhelming feeling of being watched. You know that feeling when the woods go dead silent and your primitive brain starts screaming at you that something's wrong? It was like that, but 100 times worse. I decided to set up my trail camera to monitor the area. I had a new Browning trail cam that I'd been saving for deer season. I mounted it on a tree about 30 yards from my destroyed stand, facing the area. Then I went home and ordered a new platform, heavier duty this time, with steel reinforcement. The next few weeks were strange. I kept checking the camera every few days. Most of the pictures were normal. Deer, raccoons, the usual forest creatures. But there were gaps in the footage, times when the camera should have triggered but didn't. And the sounds, God, the sounds. It started with wood knocks, like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree trunk. They'd always happen at dusk or early morning, echoing through the property. Then came the screams. If you've never heard a Bigfoot scream, count yourself lucky. It's not like any known animal. The closest I can compare it to is a woman screaming mixed with a lion's roar, but that doesn't do it justice. The first time I heard it, I was checking the camera in the early evening. The sound came from somewhere behind me, maybe 200 yards away, and it literally made me freeze in place. It was so loud it seemed to vibrate in my chest. After about 2 weeks, I finally got my new platform installed. I used heavy-gauge steel supports this time, with grade 8 bolts and extra reinforcement. I was determined to have it ready for the upcoming deer season. I set up a second trail camera, specifically to watch the new stand. That's when things escalated. It was November 3rd when I checked the cameras again. The first camera showed nothing unusual, but the second one, I'll never forget what I saw. The timestamp showed 2:47 a.m. The infrared footage clearly showed something massive, at least 8 feet tall, approaching my new platform. The creature moved with purpose, reaching up and grabbing the platform. What happened next still haunts me. This thing, this absolutely massive being, ripped my reinforced steel platform off the tree like it was made of paper. The camera caught about 3 seconds of clear footage before it stopped recording. The figure was massive, covered in what looked like dark fur, with incredibly long arms. The proportions were all wrong for a person in a suit. The arms were too long, the shoulders too wide. The way it moved was fluid, powerful, nothing like a person trying to fake something. When I went to check the stand the next day, the destruction was even worse than the first time. The steel supports were bent and twisted. There were new claw marks on the tree, and this time I found 3 clear footprints in a line, heading deeper into the woods. I measured them, 16.5 inches long, 8 inches wide at the ball of the foot. The smell was what got me this time. This overwhelming, pungent odor, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation and something musky I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I've gutted deer and come across all sorts of dead animals in the woods, but this smell was different. It seemed to cling to the area for days. I haven't rebuilt the stand. I still hunt other parts of my property, but I avoid that spot now. Sometimes, especially on quiet evenings, I still hear those wood knocks and occasional screams from that section of the woods. I've thought about reporting it, but who would believe me? I've got the pictures and videos saved on multiple hard drives. The claw marks are still visible on that oak tree. I know how this sounds. If someone had told me this story 2 years ago, I would have thought they were crazy or lying. But I know what I saw. I know what destroyed my stands. And I know that something is still out there in those Mississippi woods that defies explanation. The thing that really gets to me, it seemed intelligent. The way it specifically targeted my hunting stands. How it waited until night to approach. How it avoided most camera triggers. This wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. Whatever this was, it was sending me a message. This is its territory, not mine. I still hunt, but I'm a lot more cautious now. I pay attention to those moments when the woods go quiet. I notice when the air gets thick with that musky smell. And sometimes, when I'm sitting in my new stand, in a completely different part of my property, I can't shake the feeling that something out there is watching me, waiting and thinking. Story 20. It was early October 2020, and I was conducting research on the northern spotted owl population in the area. I'd set up my equipment about 4 miles east of Prospect, Oregon, in a particularly dense section of old-growth forest. The spot was perfect, relatively untouched, with minimal human traffic and recent reports of owl activity in the area. My setup was pretty standard. Several high-quality audio recorders, about $2,000 each, mounted on trees at various heights, motion-activated trail cameras, and some basic camping gear. I'd been doing this kind of work for over a decade, and everything about that first day felt normal. The weather was typical for October in Oregon, overcast, around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, with a light drizzle that came and went throughout the day. I remember checking the weather report that morning, worried about my equipment getting too wet, but the forecast showed the rain would clear up by evening. I spent most of the day setting up my observation posts and mounting equipment. It was tedious work, but necessary. Each recorder needed to be perfectly positioned to capture the owl's vocalizations. The first hint that something was off came around 4:30 p.m. I was securing the last recorder about 15 feet up a Douglas fir when I noticed how quiet it had gotten. Now, forests get quiet. It's normal. But this was different. It was like someone had hit a mute button. No chickadees, no nuthatches, not even the usual rustling of squirrels. Just dead silence. I've experienced sudden quiet in forests before, usually when there's a predator around like a cougar or bear. But those silences typically don't last more than a few minutes. This one stretched on and on. I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear anything. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I had this overwhelming feeling of being watched. I stayed in the tree longer than I needed to, pretending to adjust the equipment while scanning the forest floor. The rational part of my brain said it was probably just a bear, but something felt different. Wrong. I waited until I couldn't justify staying up there any longer, then carefully made my way down. As I was walking back to my camp, I caught a whiff of something that made me gag. It was this overwhelming stench, like a mix of wet rotting leaves, decay, and something musky I couldn't identify. I've smelled dead animals, bear scat, all sorts of forest odors, but this was uniquely awful. It seemed to come in waves, stronger when the wind shifted from the north. I made it back to camp, just as dusk was settling in. My tent was exactly as I'd left it, but something had definitely been through my supplies. The plastic container where I kept my trail mix was crushed, not torn open by claws or teeth, but literally crushed, like something had squeezed it. The weird thing was, none of the food was taken. Around 8 p.m., I started hearing things. At first, it was just the sound of branches breaking, not unusual in itself, except these weren't the small snaps you get from falling branches or deer moving through the forest. These were loud cracks, like something massive was moving through the trees. They seemed to circle my camp, never getting too close but never really moving away either. Then came the first vocalization. I've recorded all sorts of animal sounds over the years, but this was unlike anything in my experience. It started as a low rumble, almost below the range of human hearing, then rose into this long, wavering call that seemed to go on forever. It wasn't a wolf or a cougar. It was too deep, too powerful. The sound seemed to come from something massive, and it reverberated through the entire valley. I sat frozen in my tent, trying to convince myself this was some kind of known animal. But then it happened. My laptop started going crazy with alerts from the audio recorders. Something was moving through my study area, triggering all the equipment in sequence. Whatever it was big enough to trigger the motion sensors I'd placed at height. Around midnight, I heard the first recorder get destroyed. The sound of metal and plastic being crushed was unmistakable. Then another, and another. Each destruction was accompanied by these deep, angry grunts, not like any bear or other animal I'd ever heard. The sounds were deliberate, almost methodical. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat there, my flashlight off, listening to my equipment being systematically destroyed. The worst part was knowing that whatever was out there knew exactly where my recorders were, even the ones hidden high in the trees. When dawn finally came, I waited a full hour after sunrise before leaving my tent. What I found still haunts me. Every single recorder was destroyed, not just damaged, but completely mangled. The metal casings were crushed and twisted with deep teeth marks that didn't match any known predator. Some of the trees where I'd mounted equipment had deep gouges in them, far higher than a bear could reach. But the most disturbing thing I found was about 100 yards from my camp. Several young Douglas firs, each about 4 inches in diameter, had been twisted together into a kind of arch. Not broken or bent, twisted, like someone had braided them together while they were still alive. The force required to do this would be immense, and the precision, it wasn't random damage, it was deliberate. I spent about an hour photographing everything and collecting what was left of my equipment. Every few minutes I'd hear that eerie silence fall over the forest again. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just complete stillness. Then I'd get that feeling of being watched, accompanied by that same putrid odor. I was packing up my tent when I heard it. One final vocalization, much closer this time. It came from just beyond the tree line, maybe 50 yards away. The sound started as that same low rumble, but this time it rose into something that sounded almost like words. Not English, not any language, but definitely patterned sounds. The forest fell silent again, and in that silence, I heard heavy footsteps moving away through the underbrush. I grabbed my remaining gear and got out of there as fast as I could. The whole way back to my car, I kept hearing branches break behind me, always just out of sight. That feeling of being watched didn't leave until I was back on the main road. I filed a report with the Forest Service, but they just chalked it up to bear damage. But I know bears. I've dealt with them destroying equipment before. This was different. The teeth marks on my recorders, I still have the pieces, don't match any known species. The twisted trees are still there. I've checked satellite images. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear that sound in my dreams, that deep, rumbling, almost speech that made every bird for miles fall silent. I haven't gone back to that specific location, but I've had to continue my research in other parts of the forest. I've started carrying a personal locator beacon, and I never stay in one spot after dark anymore. The worst part is, every time I'm out there now, I catch myself listening for that silence, that complete absence of sound that I now know means something is watching. I've tried to rationalize what happened, to find some logical explanation. But the systematic destruction of the equipment, the twisted trees, those vocalizations. I'm a scientist. I deal in facts and evidence. And the fact is, what I encountered out there doesn't fit any known species. The Forest Service has my report filed away somewhere, along with the photos of the damage. But they don't show the whole story. They don't capture that feeling of absolute wrongness that came over the forest that night, or the intelligence behind those sounds. I don't know what was out there in Prospect that night, but I know it was aware of me, and it wanted me to know it was aware. Sometimes I think about going back with better equipment, trying to document it properly. But then I remember the way those trees were twisted, the force required to crush my recorders like they were made of paper, and that deep, rumbling, almost speech. And I decide some things are better left unrecorded. Story 21. I've lived in Vermont my whole life, and my family has been making maple syrup on our property just outside Montpelier for 3 generations. I never believed in any of those Bigfoot stories people would tell around here. Sure, we'd hear about occasional sightings in the more remote parts of the state, but I always brushed them off. That changed in March 2021. Our sugar bush operation isn't huge, about 250 maple trees spread across 40 acres of our land. We use a mix of traditional buckets and more modern tubing systems to collect the sap. It's not a fancy setup, but it's been reliable for decades. That spring started normally enough. We got the taps in during late February when the temperatures were perfect, below freezing at night and above freezing during the day. The first sign something was wrong came on March 12th. I headed out early that morning to check the lines and buckets, like I always do. The sun wasn't even up yet, and there was still a heavy frost on the ground. As I approached the first cluster of trees, my flashlight beam caught something that made my stomach drop. All 5 buckets in that section were crushed, not just knocked down, but literally crushed like someone had taken a sledgehammer to them. The metal was twisted and mangled. I thought maybe some kids had vandalized our equipment, but then I noticed the footprints. The ground was partially frozen, but whatever made these prints was heavy enough to leave deep impressions. They were huge, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. I've tracked every kind of animal we have in Vermont, and I'd never seen anything like this. The stride length between prints was massive, probably around 6 feet. Following the tracks, I discovered more destruction. Every collection point had been systematically damaged. The plastic tubing was ripped apart, and even the spiles, the taps we drill into the trees, had been yanked out, leaving ragged holes in the bark. Some of the metal buckets looked like they'd been crumpled in someone's fist. The damage pattern was bizarre. Whatever did this had methodically moved from tree to tree, destroying everything we used to collect sap. The really unsettling part was the smell. There was this overwhelming musky odor around the damaged areas, like wet dog mixed with something rotting. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I've dealt with bears plenty of times, but this smell was different, more pungent and somehow more primitive. I called my wife and son out to see. We took photos and even called the game warden, though I felt kind of foolish suggesting what I was starting to suspect. The warden documented everything but didn't have any explanation. He suggested maybe black bears, but I've dealt with bear damage before. Bears are messy and random in their destruction. This was deliberate and systematic. We repaired what we could and replaced the damaged equipment. It cost us nearly $2,000 and 3 days of lost sap collection during prime sugaring season. But that was just the beginning. About a week later, we started hearing the screams at night. I'm not talking about normal wildlife sounds. We're used to foxes, coyotes, and the occasional mountain lion. These were different. They started around 10 p.m. that first night. I was in the barn doing a final check on our horses when I heard it, a long guttural howl that seemed to echo through the entire valley. It was deep, almost like a whale song, but more aggressive and definitely coming from somewhere in our woods. The horses completely freaked out. All 4 of them started kicking their stalls and trying to bolt. I've never seen them that terrified. The screams continued for about 20 minutes, moving through different parts of our property. Sometimes they seemed to be answering each other, like there was more than one whatever it was out there. My son thought he saw something that night through his bedroom window. His room overlooks the edge of the woods where we have our sugar shack. He said he saw a massive dark figure moving between the trees. According to him, it was at least 8 feet tall and seemed to be walking on 2 legs. I tried to tell myself he was just spooked by the sounds and his imagination was running wild. But after what I'd seen with the footprints, I wasn't so sure anymore. The screams continued for several nights. We started keeping the horses in the barn 24/7 because they'd get so agitated at night. Our dogs refused to go out after dark, and they're usually fearless. We'd find more footprints every morning, always the same massive size, usually circling our property line like whatever it was patrolling. One night, about 2 weeks after the initial damage, I got up around 2 a.m. because I heard something heavy walking around outside. The moon was nearly full, and when I looked out our bedroom window, I saw it. About 100 yards from the house, standing in the clearing near our sugar shack, was something I still have trouble explaining. It was huge, exactly like my son had described. The moonlight clearly showed its silhouette. It was covered in dark hair, with incredibly long arms that hung down past its knees. The way it moved was what struck me most, fluid and deliberate, definitely not a person in a suit. As I watched, it reached up and effortlessly broke off a branch from a maple tree that had to be at least 12 feet up. The strength required to do that so casually was terrifying. I stood there frozen, watching it examine the branch before tossing it aside like it was nothing. Then it turned its head toward the house. I don't know if it could see me through the window, but I felt this overwhelming sense of being watched. The intelligence in that moment was palpable. This wasn't some animal acting on instinct. There was purpose in its movements, in the way it had systematically destroyed our sap collection equipment. It let out one of those howls I'd been hearing, and I felt it vibrate through the entire house. Then it just turned and walked into the woods, its stride matching exactly with the spacing of those footprints I'd been finding. The entire encounter lasted maybe 2 minutes, but it fundamentally changed everything I thought I knew about our woods. The strange activity continued for about another week. We'd hear the screams, find fresh footprints, and occasionally catch glimpses of movement in the woods. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. No more screams, no more footprints, no more equipment damage. It was like whatever it was just moved on. We've had a couple of odd incidents since then, Missing tools from the sugar shack, strange sounds in the distance, but nothing like those 3 weeks in March 2021. We still make syrup, but we've switched entirely to the tubing system since it's easier to repair than replacing crushed buckets. I've installed security cameras around the property, though part of me hopes I never capture anything on them. Some things are better left as mysteries. I know how this all sounds. If someone had told me this story 3 years ago, I would have thought they were making it up or had seen a bear. But I know what I saw. Those footprints were real. We still have the photos. That figure in the moonlight was real. The damage to our equipment was real. Whatever it was seemed to have a particular interest in our sugaring operation, almost like it was sending a message about its territory. The hardest part is knowing that it's probably still out there. Every time I work in the sugar bush now, especially during sugaring season, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. The woods feel different to me now. They're still beautiful, still home, but they hold secrets I never believed in before. I've learned to respect that there are things in this world we can't explain, and sometimes the best thing to do is simply acknowledge their existence and give them their space. Story 22. I've worked in logging for over 15 years in the Pacific Northwest, but what happened during my shifts in Concrete, Washington back in 2019 still keeps me up at night sometimes. I need to get this off my chest because it's been eating at me, and I know what I experienced wasn't normal. It started in early October. The weather was getting colder, and we were working a section about 12 miles east of Concrete, deep in the Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest. I was operating heavy equipment for Wallace Timber Company, and we had a decent-sized crew of about 8 guys working that section. The first weird thing I noticed was the broken trees. Now I've seen all kinds of forest damage in my career, storm damage, disease, animal activity, you name it. But these breaks were different. We're talking about solid Douglas firs, some 14, 16 inches in diameter, snapped clean off at heights of 15, 20 feet. Not splintered or torn like storm damage, but broken with almost surgical precision. The weird part? These breaks were appearing overnight in areas we'd cleared for cutting the next day. I remember bringing it up to my supervisor, Mike, during our morning briefing. He brushed it off, suggesting maybe it was wind damage or bears. But I've seen bear damage. They don't snap trees at that height, and they certainly don't do it with such clean breaks. Plus, the pattern was odd. The broken trees would appear in clusters, always 3 or 4 together, like something had systematically gone through and snapped them. The smell hit me about a week later. I was doing a final equipment check before sunset, around 6:30 p.m. The air had that typical October crispness to it, but suddenly this overwhelming stench rolled in. It wasn't like anything I'd smelled in the woods before, not a dead animal, not skunk spray. The best way I can describe it is a mix between rotting meat and wet, moldy fur, but even that doesn't quite capture it. It was so strong it made my eyes water. That's when the sound started. I was about 200 yards from my truck and the forest had gone dead quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing, just complete silence. Then I heard it, the sound of massive branches breaking one after another, crack, crack, crack. These weren't small twigs. These were the sounds of thick branches being snapped like toothpicks. The breaks were coming from behind me, maybe 150 yards away. I froze. Every instinct told me to run, but I couldn't move. The breaking sounds were getting closer, methodical, almost deliberate. Then came the footsteps, heavy, way too heavy to be a bear or elk. The ground literally trembled with each step. I slowly turned around, and that's when I saw it through the trees. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was massive, at least 9 feet tall, maybe taller. The shoulders were impossibly broad, covered in dark brown, almost black fur. But what struck me most was how it moved. It wasn't lumbering like a bear. It moved with purpose, almost human-like, but not quite. The thing was partially obscured by the trees, but I could make out its silhouette clearly against the dimming sky. Its head was conical, sitting directly on those massive shoulders with barely any neck visible. The arms were incredibly long, hanging down past its knees. I stood there, completely paralyzed, as it methodically reached up, way up, and snapped another branch, this one probably 18 feet off the ground. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence. It didn't seem aggressive. It was almost like it was marking its territory or sending some kind of message. The worst part was when it turned its head toward me. I couldn't make out its face clearly in the growing darkness, but I could feel it looking right at me. The eyes caught what little light was left, reflecting back with a reddish glow. My whole body went cold, and I broke out in a cold sweat despite the chilly air. I'd love to say I did something brave or clever, but I didn't. When it took a step in my direction, I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. I could hear it moving through the forest behind me, not running but walking with these huge, ground-shaking steps. The smell got stronger, almost unbearable, and the sound of breaking branches followed me all the way back to my truck. I jumped in, started the engine, and got out of there as fast as I could on those logging roads. In my rearview mirror, I swear I saw something massive move across the road in the beam of my taillights, but it was too dark to be sure. The next day, I went back with 3 other guys to check the area. We found 5 more broken trees, all snapped at about the same height. The breaks were fresh. We also found footprints, huge ones, about 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. They were deep too, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. The stride length between prints was over 6 feet. What really gets me is what happened over the next few weeks. The activity didn't stop. We'd find new broken trees every few days, always in the same pattern. The smell would come and go, and everyone on the crew started experiencing it. 2 guys quit. We'd hear those breaking sounds in the distance, especially late in the day. But the creature, or whatever it was, seemed to keep its distance after that initial encounter. Our company brought in some wildlife experts to investigate. They took photos of the footprints and collected hair samples found on some of the broken branches. They never shared their findings with us, but I overheard one of them saying they couldn't identify the hair. It didn't match any known species in the area. The activity suddenly stopped in mid-November, right when the first heavy snows hit. It was like whatever it was just vanished. We never had another incident like that in that area, but I still won't work there alone, especially late in the day. I've been a skeptic my whole life. I used to laugh at stories about Bigfoot and other creatures in these woods, but after what I experienced, I don't laugh anymore. Whatever I encountered that day wasn't a bear, wasn't an elk, and definitely wasn't human. The broken trees, the footprints, the smell, the way it moved. None of it fits with any animal I've encountered in 15 years of working these forests. I still work in logging, but I've transferred to a different area. Sometimes, when I'm working late and the forest goes quiet, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that massive silhouette again. The worst part isn't the fear, it's the certainty. The certainty that something else is out there in these woods, something we can't explain, something that's watching us more than we realize. I've never told this story publicly before. Most people wouldn't believe it anyway. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and what I smelled. Those trees didn't break themselves, and those footprints didn't appear out of nowhere. Something was out there in those woods near concrete, and sometimes I think it's still out there, just waiting. Story 23. I'd heard about this secluded thermal spring deep in the Ozark foothills, about 7 miles northeast of Heber Springs. Local hunters had mentioned seeing unusual wildlife activity there, especially during the colder months. As a photographer specializing in nocturnal wildlife, this seemed like a perfect opportunity. The spring was off any marked trails, which meant minimal human interference with my shots. I arrived early that morning, around 5:30 a.m., while it was still dark. The temperature was in the low 40s, and a light fog hung over the ground. I'd brought my best equipment: 3 Browning Dark Ops Pro trail cameras with infrared capability, my Canon R5 with a night lens for manual shooting, and all my usual gear. The spring itself was maybe 20 feet across, surrounded by dense forest. Steam rose steadily from the surface, creating this otherworldly atmosphere in the pre-dawn light. Setting up took about 2 hours. I positioned the trail cameras in a triangle formation around the spring, each about 30 feet back from the water's edge, mounted on trees at different heights. The first was at chest height, aimed slightly downward. The second was lower, about 2 feet off the ground, and the third was higher up, maybe 8 feet, to catch any larger animals that might visit. Each camera had a clear view of the spring through gaps in the vegetation. I also set up a blind about 50 yards away where I could do manual photography if anything interesting showed up. The day passed quietly. I checked the cameras every few hours, mostly capturing deer, raccoons, and a few wild turkeys. Around 4 p.m., something strange happened. The woods went completely silent. You know that eerie quiet that comes before a storm? It was like that, but worse. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. The hair on my neck stood up, and I had this overwhelming feeling of being watched. I've spent enough time in the woods to know when something's off, and everything in me was screaming that something wasn't right. I retreated to my blind and stayed there until sunset, but nothing unusual appeared. By 7 p.m. I was cold and hungry, so I decided to head back to my truck, grab some food, and return for the night session. The spring was most active after dark, according to locals. When I returned around 8:30 p.m., the temperature had dropped to the mid-30s. The steam from the spring was more pronounced, creating this thick, swirling mist that my headlamp couldn't penetrate more than a few feet. I made my way to the blind, settled in with my camera, and prepared for a long night. At 11:17 p.m., I know the exact time because of the timestamp on my cameras, I heard the first tree knock. If you've never heard one, it's like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree trunk. A sharp, deliberate sound that carries through the woods. It came from the north, maybe 100 yards out. I've heard woodpeckers and falling branches. This was neither. This was intentional. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my camera. The knock was answered by another, this time from the east, closer to the spring. Then came the smell. Everyone who's ever reported these encounters mentions it, but nothing prepares you for it. It was like a combination of wet dog, rotting vegetation, and something musky I can't even describe. The smell was so strong it made my eyes water. Through my night vision scope, I could see the steam from the spring swirling strangely, as if something was disturbing the air around it. Then I heard it. Heavy footsteps, bipedal, moving with purpose. The stride was too long to be human. The sound circled the spring, always staying just out of clear sight in the mist. At 11:43 p.m., my first trail camera triggered, then the second, then the third. Whatever it was big enough to trigger all 3 cameras from different angles. I sat perfectly still in my blind, my heart pounding so hard I was worried the sound would give away my position. Then it stepped into view. Through the steam, I saw it enter the spring. The figure was enormous. I'm 6'2", and this thing had at least 2 feet on me. It moved like a person, but wrong. The proportions were off. The arms hung too low, the shoulders too wide. The steam made it hard to get a clear look, but the infrared cameras caught everything. The creature stayed in the spring for approximately 12 minutes. It seemed to be bathing. It would submerge partially, then rise up, water cascading off its massive frame. The fur, and it was definitely fur, not clothing, appeared thick and dark, matted in some places. When it turned its head, I caught a glimpse of its face through the steam. A mixture of human and ape-like features that my brain still struggles to process. What strikes me most in retrospect was how deliberate its movements were. This wasn't some animal stumbling upon a water source. It knew the spring was there. It had a purpose. Several times it seemed to look directly toward my blind, and I swear it knew I was there. But it never approached, never showed any aggression. At one point, it made a sound that I'll never forget. A low, rumbling vocalization that seemed to resonate in my chest. It wasn't aggressive, wasn't a roar or a scream like you hear in stories. It was almost contemplative. I know how that sounds, but that's the only way I can describe it. The encounter ended as strangely as it began. The creature simply stepped out of the spring on the far side, shook itself like a dog, and walked into the forest. The last camera triggered at 12:02 a.m. The entire encounter lasted less than 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. I waited in that blind until dawn, too terrified to move. When first light came, I practically ran to check the cameras. All 3 had triggered multiple times. The batteries in one were completely drained, which shouldn't have been possible. They were brand new. I found footprints in the soft earth around the spring, but the steam and water had made them indistinct. What I did find were broken branches on trees surrounding the spring, broken at a height of about 8 feet, with twists in the wood that could only come from something with immense strength. The camera footage. I've spent months analyzing it. The steam creates this frustrating obscurity, but what's clear is undeniable. The infrared captures show a massive bipedal figure, at least 8 feet tall, moving with an ease that no person in a suit could replicate. The proportions, the muscle mass visible through the fur, the way it moved. It's like nothing I've ever seen in 15 years of wildlife photography. I've struggled with whether to share this story. The footage is compelling but not definitive. The steam and mist create just enough ambiguity that skeptics can dismiss it. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And most importantly, I know what I felt in those moments. That feeling of being in the presence of something ancient, something that shouldn't exist in our modern world, but somehow still does. I've returned to that spring several times since, but I've never seen the creature again. The cameras have captured nothing unusual. It's like that night exists in isolation, a moment when something impossible stepped into our world and then vanished just as mysteriously. The experience changed me. I've spent my career documenting wildlife, believing I understood the natural world. Now I know better. There are things in our forests that defy explanation, that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear to know. I don't expect everyone to believe my story, but I know what I saw that night at the spring, and I know I'm not alone in what I've seen. Every time I go into the woods now, I feel different, more aware, more cautious, and sometimes, when the woods go quiet and that familiar feeling of being watched creeps over me, I wonder if it's out there, watching, waiting for another moment when the steam and shadows align just right to reveal itself again. I still have the footage, though I'm hesitant to share it publicly. Not because I'm afraid of ridicule, but because that place feels special now, almost sacred. I worry that if I reveal its location, the spring would be overrun with curiosity seekers, destroying the very solitude that seems to draw these creatures there. The questions haunt me. Was it drawn to the thermal spring for warmth? Is this a regular part of its territory? How many others are out there? But maybe some questions aren't meant to be answered. Maybe some mysteries should remain just that. Mysteries. One thing's certain. I'll never forget that night in Heber Springs, when the steam rose from the water and something straight out of myth stepped into view, reminding me that our world is far stranger and more wonderful than we imagine.